a research-based project that combines performative actions, debates, and talks. On behalf of Matt, we'd like to welcome you to this event and to thank Lucinda and all the EFAULA team, also our participants to the roundtable and talks, and all the public here and at home. We hope you enjoy it and you come back for the next sessions, 3 more. And I leave you with Lucinda, who's the curator of the project. Thank you all.
Good afternoon. Sorry for the delay. Welcome all to Counter Architecture Reconstructing Reality. We would like to thank Beatriz Lianza for this challenge, Matt Fundação EDP for all the support, IFABULA team, Teatro Praga, and our institutional partners. After the Second World War, the first systematic manifestations of a clear rejection of a mentality that had led us here emerged. It was the renouncement of a well-being and happiness programmed by the commerce and the industry based on infinite consumption. It was a kind of revolution in mentalities led by a new generation that was conventionally called counterculture. Humanity intended to save itself. Give peace a chance, said John Lennon. Remember? What artists wanted was obviously to save the world from the threat of nuclear bombs and environmental threats, from everything that seemed to be efficient, but was above all artificial. In this early 21st century, only a counter-architecture will save architecture itself for practically analogous reasons. A new powerful argument has been imposed by common sense, a tool that cannot be ignored, science. It is not exactly quite like this, but counter-architecture is a way of rethinking construction and urbanity. How? Why? Because we must redefine the responsibility of architecture with regard to the impact of human interventions on the environment. It is only possible from a new ethical perspective. Counter-architecture is a challenge to architects to come out of their comfort zones and try to listen to what other disciplines have to say, especially in these very peculiar moments. The foundational question for counter-architecture is, what will be the role of architecture in the future? We propose 4 binary axes as filters for approaching this subject. Filter 1, today, reality fantasy, corresponds to a psychological dimension, which explores how institutional fictions influence the way we perceive the world, therefore forcing architects to reinvent, to reinterpret, to give new meaning to reality. Filter number 2, control transgression, stands for the legal dimension of things, meaning the management of permissions and prohibitions. Architecture must take a creative and critical stance here towards this artificial framework that needs to be constantly questioned. Filter number 3, disclosure concealment, depicts the communicational dimension, which allows us to decode the representation of the world. Architecture, as a technical and artistic product, has a twofold responsibility, acting as an encoder and a decoder of that representation. Filter number 4, logic absurd, underpins the philosophical dimension, which reclaims a revision of our value system in order to reevaluate and to reconceive a responsible spatial practice aimed at confronting the environmental crisis. Video.
Pois é. O mundo não cessa de girar e os homens continuam a interrogar-se sobre o seu destino. Sobre as causas e sobre os efeitos. Sobre a justiça e sobre a responsabilidade. Sobre o bem e sobre o mal. Sobre a vida e sobre a morte. Sobre as suas crenças. E sobre aquilo que os impede de crer. E quando é que surgem estas interrogações? Sempre. Não. Apenas nos momentos em que os homens são assaltados por dúvidas. Naqueles momentos de crise. Quando se sentem ameaçados. Quando sabem que não podem evitar um olhar à sua volta. É assim. O medo guia a nossa capacidade de compreendermos um mundo que, de repente, se tornou estranho. Subitamente. É como se as nossas certezas tivessem sido engolidas por uma realidade que já não quer saber de nós. E porquê que isto sucede? Pois. Porque se calhar nos portámos mal. Sigam lá o meu raciocínio. Acham que o mundo, este simpático planeta cujos recantos mais inacessíveis já conseguimos ocupar, começou de súbito a querer fazer-nos compreender que afinal ele não foi criado para nos divertirmos? Então, porra, isto não é tudo nosso. Andam para aí a dizer que não podemos matar, devorar, transformar tudo aquilo que quisermos. Os animais, as plantas, a água, as rochas, deixaram de ser protagonistas no cenário desta nossa brincadeira universal? Porquê é que a malvada da natureza se voltou contra nós? Porquê é que ela quer impedir que acreditemos naquele nosso sonho recorrente de sermos os reis deste mundo todo, do universo até? Será que descobrimos que, afinal, não passamos de uns símios tontos e malcriados que danificam tudo aquilo em que tocam? Os jornais e a televisão vomitam quase todos os dias notícias calamitosas relacionadas com a fome, com as alterações climáticas, com as doenças, com a poluição, com as radiações perigosas ou com a possibilidade de deflagração de guerras. Mas que diabo! Por que é que nos meteram na cabeça que quem mandava aqui éramos nós, quando afinal o nosso poder aqui é bem precário? Será que o sonho de um paraíso terreal, que também nunca deixámos de alimentar, se desvaneceu para todo sempre? Olhamos para a paisagem e percebemos os traços da nossa presença como uma espécie de contaminação. Deixámos de ser bonitos, Xissa. Deixámos de ser virtuosos. Deixámos de ser saudáveis. Deixámos de cheirar bem. A nossa ciência, afinal, não sabe tudo. Não pode tudo. Pois é. A nossa própria sobrevivência enquanto espécie animal tornou-se bem incerta. Ai, que chatice. Que incómodo. Chega a ser insultuoso até ter consciência que estas ameaças pavorosas são reais. E onde se manifestarão elas? Apetece-nos perguntar. Nos atuais palcos de guerra? De fome? Em algum país martirizado de outro continente? Longe da civilização. Ou pelo menos longe dos centros urbanos, nos bairros periféricos de alguma cidade cosmopolita? Não. 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 3 vezes não. O que se irá passar? Passar-se-á aqui, no espaço dos nossos movimentos, nos lugares que nos são familiares, cujos contornos já memorizamos e que nos dão a sensação de pertencermos a um sítio, que nos permitem sentir o doce aconchego de um abrigo, mas que afinal não nos conseguem abrigar, porque o fantasma do que aí vem já aqui está. Derramou-se como uma sarna invisível que não respeita hierarquias, mentalidades, credos, nem privilégios económicos, nem mesmo o poder irresistível que vem de par com o sucesso. Não poderemos pagar para que a coisa aconteça pelo menos longe do sítio onde habitamos. A resposta já a sabíamos de antemão. Um não categórico e definitivo. É incrível! É imoral! É grotesco, é revoltante. Então, e daqui a quanto tempo é que mergulharemos nesta obscenidade? Daqui a 1000 anos? Não. 500, vá. 100? 50? Não. Nem o espaço de uma geração. Já aqui está. Mas o que mais nos assusta é não sabermos onde é que isto tudo vai dar. Os efeitos do que já está a acontecer são imprevisíveis. Como é possível, numa sociedade civilizada como a nossa, termos chegado a esta situação? Digam-me. Mas porquê é que não fomos avisados a tempo? Porquê é que fomos tratados como se fôssemos os outros? Como se fosse impossível descortinar um sentido na evolução biológica da nossa espécie. Como se, ao fim e ao cabo, a face de Deus não resultasse de uma média estatística idealizada das nossas faces caucasianas, de expressão serena, benevolente, irradiando esmagadora beleza. E pronto, não digo mais nada. Porque, atenção, a delicadeza é tudo aquilo que nos resta depois de termos posto em leilão todas as outras virtudes da civilidade. Depois de tudo isto, ficou-nos apenas a delicadeza. Num gesto de nos coçarmos para aliviar a sarna do devir. O que é aquilo ali ao longe? Uma cidade? Onde é que estão os palácios de cristal? Onde estão as cúpulas douradas? Onde estão os pórticos de pedra que ornavam as ruas? Os parques luxuriantes? Vejo ruínas e fumo de fogos. O príncipe onde está? Sob os escombros. Soterrado. Fugiu? E pode-se fugir disto? Para onde?
A nossa convidada para nos... Desculpem. Our guest to talk with us about this first filter, reality fantasy, is Rania Ghosh. She is a co-founder of Design Earth, an architectural research-led practice by her and El Hadi Dairi. Design Earth deploys aesthetics as a form of environmental engagement in the age of climate change. Ghosh and Zaidi are authors of Geostories, another architecture for the environment, Actar 2018, and Geographies of Trash, Actar 2015. Rania is Associate Professor of Architecture and Urbanism at Massachusetts Institute of Technology School of Architecture and Planning. Thank you, Rania, for being here, and I will give you the words.
Thank you, Lucinda, for the invite, and it's a pleasure to join you for Counter Architecture. My desire is that we convene again in beautiful Lisbon at some point in the future, but kudos to make it all happen in spite of our current planetary situation. So I'll attempt a follow-up to this beautiful video that started us off, maybe in an architectural language that attempts to tell a similar story to the one that we just heard. I'll share a PowerPoint presentation and I'll walk us from there. 1 second, please bear with me. We tried this and it works. All right. Thank you for your patience. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, great. So today, I'd like to think with you of the agency of the architectural project in making visible and political some of these planetary concerns between what the Earth is and what it should be. I'll propose that speculative thinking, the belief that thoughts and actions and representations can influence the real, might allow us to move beyond the realism fiction binary in search of fiction as a register through which to reform reality, to produce a new form for that reality. The talk will follow an outline similar to that of the recently published Geostories, Another Architecture of the Environment. I'll start with a compact, brief but dense introduction to some of the conceptual questions of the work. And I'll follow with three projects, one from each section of the book: Terrarium, Aquarium, and Planetarium. It's a series of strategy to make visible geographic concerns through drawing and narrative, which has at its core an attempt to reconnect critique and praxis, and reconcile the weight of violent environmental histories and practice with visions of a future that is still worth imagining and living. You'll see that each of these projects, rather than resolution, they maintain a tension. It's not a documentary, but it's not either entirely fictional. Stories matter to the Earth. The condition of the current environmental crisis have relied on narratives of industrial modernity. Oil and gas companies tell us stories about the world as resource, about nature as external, about progress as an escape from nature's determinations and limit, and about technology as a quasi-autonomous prime mover. Spatial representation is complicit in such perpetuations of stories and myth, such as the image from Total's promotional campaign with a binary and rigid symmetry between a Manhattan-like metropolis and a polar perspection landform. Such organization of carbon urbanism rests on technological systems that extract geographies from uh, domains beyond the island's jurisdictions, all while keeping our urbanity outside of the negative externalities of such processes, or what we call shortly externalities. So, stories of the Earth, as we've been told, have rested on this abstraction of geographic externalities. They're out of view, out of debate, out of concern. Or if they don't exist or if they're not represented, then energy companies cannot be held accountable and pay the reparations for such environmental transformations. Environmentalists, however, have brought to our attention that there are no externalities, no outside in which the unwanted consequences of our actions can disappear from view. The environmental crisis is not only a crisis of the physical environment, it's also a predicament of the cultural environment, of these spatial systems of representation through which society relates to complex environmental issues in their vast scales of time and space. So, at the moment when we can no longer imagine the world without externalities, we need to tell other stories in which such externalities are integral, they're at the core rather than incidental or invisible to the narratives of the Earth. Not very dissimilar from the encounter of Dr. Frankenstein and its creature on the glacier in the Alps. The the French philosopher Bruno Latour reminds us that the monster was not born a monster at all. It became destructive only after being left alone, abandoned in the laboratory by a horrified creator the moment he twitched to light. In that, we hear the invitation of feminist philosophers who invites us to stay with the trouble, to look at Frankenstein, to stay with Mother Frankenstein and not to abandon them. But to quote Donna Haraway, that the only ethical option is to stay with these technological and environmental matters. So, how do we convert into image and narrative the geographic externalities and our technological Frankenstein moment? And how do we do that in a way that produces accounts that are even more fantastic than the stories of industrial capitalism? So that to communicate that which our numerous scientific reports alone, with the exponential curve, the diagram flows, the science reports and newspapers, all of which they're failing to communicate or at least to impact action. It's a very modest attempt to propose that maybe speculative narrative and the way that it persistently engage with technological questions in relation to the planet, including those created by our current risk scenarios, can open up stories to urgent trouble and relentless diversity. So, how do we not live on a blue marble that is viewed from outside an objective, holistic, impersonal Earth that is only made possible by satellite imagery? And how do we celebrate instead a grounded view, an aesthetic project for the way we read the Earth? That's the proposal that I will share with you tonight, and that geographic aesthetics as a practice has been core to the thinking and practice of Design Earth. Aesthetic as a way to pursue an ethical impulse to make the Earth visible, critical, and speculative. So, architecture has historically inflected how humans see and understand the cosmos, not least through the infamous example of the Parthenon and the way it organizes, the pantheon and the way it organizes the relationship between gods and natural phenomena. So, the Blue Marble Circus, the project which also makes the cover of the book, revisits the pantheon to render visible the spherical architecture of the cosmos that is inscribed within architecture. This écorché drawing peels off some of the ribs to reveal and stage a blue marble in an age of climate emergency. It also calls for another representational worldview, which embodies both the world of science and mythology together. What again Bruno Latour and Isabelle Stengers tell us is that Gaia is intruding, she's approaching. It has become, once again, an agent of our common geostory. The problem, Latour continues, becomes for all of us in philosophy, science or literature, the arts, of how do we tell such a story. So this is an attempt for architecture to contain a planet that exceeds all attempts to contain it. It's a search for a quest or a quest for an alternative to figure how do we hold what Atlas once held on its shoulder, and what kind of stories do we see from within that. Design Earth draws on the geographic imagination to design with externalities, to make legible the geographies of technological system at multiple scale, including those here of satellite debris in the Earth geostationary orbit, to visualize how they change the Earth, and to foreground them as new elements and scales for design. Geography is also a form of a synthetic aesthetic knowledge, in which the geographic drawing becomes a privileged mode of representation. And the section drawing in particular, with its legacy from the Aquarium view in the Museums of Natural History and Drawings, shows domains both above and below the surface of the water or the ground. So we're no longer in a paradigm that sees the Earth from above, maps flows and movement, but we actually see disciplines and scales and relationship to each other. It's a shift from a landscape of nature to a portrait of nature, which presents a totality of these scales and sciences, thinking from astronomy to geography and geology. It's important to keep in mind that although Alexander von Humboldt's avowed purpose was that of a scientific traveler, his drawing assembled forms of knowledge which kept in mind the aesthetic experience of the reader, of the viewer. So the question of politics and aesthetics as core to the projects of representation are important to set us into a new assembly of a world and the new values we want to live with. So that's the structure of what I will follow in terms of project presentation. I'll start with Terrarium, with the After Oil project, Aquarium with Pacific Aquarium, and then the Planetarium with Cosmorama. So there were some of these broad strokes from the introduction, and the book includes a series of 14 architectural projects, and I will share 3, but I'm happy to share more in the Q&A if you would like us to think more about that. So Terrarium. Frustrated by the death of his plant in polluted East London, surgeon and amateur botanist Nathaniel Ward designed a case of glass and metal that was shown in the Great Exhibition of 1851. Ward's display at the Crystal Palace set off the craze for the small glass structure, which was later termed terrarium, as part of a popularization of botany, geology, and other sciences of the earth. But if Ward's aim was to encase a small parcel of purified clean air, what might a terrarium look like if we accounted for the environmental conditions of our present moment of smokes, fires, waste, and pollutions that the science at that time was trying to keep at bay? So to read such Earth, we must become conscious of the geological dimensions of what is entombed in its layers. We must see the Earth in a section cut to acknowledge the spaces of fossil fuels and those of landfills, and to make visible the connections and changes that occur across the subsoil and the external surface of the planet. Over the past 200 years, and in particular after World War II, the fossil fuel industry, first coal, then oil and natural gas, has produced spectacular economic growth in the form of an abundant and cheap energy machine. And cheap in as far as the industry has divested itself of the cost of environmental transformations that are brought about by the global expansion of such extraction processes. Of course, oil has since shed its developmental promises. We no longer equate extraction with development. The project After Oil was commissioned for Kuwait's pavilion at the 2016 Venice Architectural Biennale. The project proposes 3 speculative tales that explore the geography of a major oil-producing region, the Persian Gulf, in the decades after oil. Each project stages critical issues of the landscape at 3 sites. The first is the site of extraction in Das Island. The second is the transit logistics of the Strait of Hormuz. And the third is a moment of oil spill at Bubiyan Island. Das Island lies 160 kilometers off the coast of Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. Since the first oil prospection expeditions in the mid-1950s, Das Island has developed into a major oil and gas industrial facility where Abu Dhabi processes, stores, and exports the crude that is pumped from its offshore fields. Such exports are a mainstay to the economy and a main driver for the urbanizations of Abu Dhabi and its sister emirates, such as Dubai, with many of the iconic towers, the world's highest towers, built from such oil wealth. Yet the relations between the wealth of the surface and the impoverishment of the underground are not presented in the same frame. Thus, crude makes visible such displacement of value in oil urbanism by collapsing, by overlaying the 2 sites, the site of extraction and its geological depth, and the architectural landmarks. You can read the drawing as both a timeline and a section. UAE's, the country's architectural landmarks, are indexed in relation to the geological depth and times of extraction of such depleted oil reservoirs. So the buildings grow higher as you dig deeper into the ground. And that brings into visibility the verticality of what lies beneath us and the volumes that are required for the building of urbanity. The after oil is not a reference only to the period that follows the depletion of non-renewable resources. It's that, but not only. To be after oil indicates that the object of oil continues to be an object of desire. It's still a race of extractive economies, and it might be till the last drop of oil in the ground, unless we take action. Oil wants to dig deeper, build higher, concentrates urbanity. So this project recovers the excavated volumes of soil and stone that are part of the extraction, the insides of the earth that are spilled out, and it builds a landform monument to the age of oil on the surface. The Strait of Hormuz is a critical transit choke point with 20% of oil traded worldwide moving by tanker through its 30-mile wide passage. The strait was never actually shut down in spite of recurrent and persistent anxieties of its possible obstruction. And this is a long-standing and running dispute between Iran on one side and the UAE, with islands, tankers, geopolitical concerns often shaping that. In the project After Oil, the revenues of what is called oil future, and oil future is the legal contract name for the trade of oil between buyers and seller. So the revenues of such oil futures perpetuate this geopolitical rivalries between countries on both shores of the Gulf in what takes the form of a territorial board game, kind of a hybrid maybe between risk, which is a strategy board game of diplomacy, a monopoly, which is based on capital development, and the multiple stories of conflict and conquest uh, when you build cities and acquire properties. So the grand chessboard repurposes the strait into this real estate geopolitical game of speculative urbanism between the two traditional adversaries, those who call it the Persian Gulf in black and those who call it the Arabian Gulf in white, and in the process absorbs much of the geographic features of the Earth in such projects. Each chess piece is an iconic project from the history of speculative urbanism, things that architects dream and look for clients for, Plan Voisin, Delirious New York, and Metabolists, etc. In this process, the geostory speaks to the meaning of speculative when it's differently associated to speculative and urbanism. What speculation, what values lies in such speculative projects? The third vignette from After Oil is Das Island, and it starts in the aftermath of the Persian Gulf in 1991, which was accompanied by what was later called a geotrauma. It's considered the largest oil spill in the world, and it drastically affected Kuwait's coastal environment. Beyond the concentrated moment and the intensity of such event in 1991, the oil industry, with its business as usual, continues to increase carbon emission, and it pushes the world to a slower form of violence, the one that we've come to refer to as the Anthropocene, or the anthropogenic effects of climate change. And Boubian Island, because it's a low-lying, flat landscape, is one of such geographies that are most vulnerable to sea level rise. There once was an island that gives form to such invisible threats. A series of vertical wooden elements are inserted into the highest 16 elevation mounds of the island to stabilize its shrinking shoreline into an archipelago of islands. The project holds all major development works currently in plan to transform the area into a major tourist resort and port facility, not unlike other similar developments in the Gulf. The island continues to be uninhabited by humans, as it has always been. It's, it's the ground for sea turtles, antelopes, and eventually other forms of life that will withstand the temperature and acidity increase associated with climate change. So After Oil is not a mere switch in energy producer. It doesn't ask us just to convert from oil to other sources of energy that are more green, although it's definitely that. What it's asking us first and foremost is to reform our geographic imagination, to begin by looking at the carbon Frankenstein, looking at its impacts, looking at the geographies that it has produced, so that we can rescue all future green energy sources from being idealized, and eventually neglected. I just wanted to mention the Trash Peaks project. I will not share much, but it's a project that it's a diorama setup where the drawings and the three-dimensionality of artifacts begin to come together. I wanted to mention it because it was a project that Design Earth brought to MAT in 2018 with the Ecovisionary exhibition. And it's a sweet reminder that maybe someday the work of Design Earth will be able to find its way back to MAT as well. The second section is Aquarium. Among the many early handbooks on aquarium care is Ocean Gardens, which introduces its readers with this following quote. To appreciate nature, the mind requires a special education, without which the eye and the ear perceive but little of the miracles passing before them. The 19th century handbook adds, the wonders of the ocean floor do not reveal themselves to vulgar eyes. Born out of this desire to represent the inaccessible, expansive, and mysterious sea, the aquarium gave a new aesthetic to the idea of evidence that marries both speculation and fantasy with scientific and technological production to create a submarine wonder of chambers. Aquariums are often populated both with mermaids and with the largest whales, or were at least. This call to educate the eye is timely to remember at a moment when humans are altering 70% of the Earth's environment, the ocean, at unprecedented scale. Oceans are the biggest resource for life on Earth. They're also the biggest dumping ground, not just materially, the amount of plastic that is dumped, but also as a carbon sink in terms of how much the ocean have absorbed the excess CO2 put into the atmosphere. So the oceans have been acidifying and warming up much excessively over the last 50 years. The ocean is a classic example of spaces that we consider to be the global commons, spaces that remain shared in our imaginary beyond the enclosures of various property lines. There's the high seas, Antarctica, and outer space. I'll touch on the high seas and outer space. There's a narrative called Of Oil and Ice for those who are interested in Antarctica that they can familiarize themselves with. And I'm happy to go over it later. So the ocean is a classic example of the global commons. It has been for long protected by the law of the sea as a common heritage of humanity. However, these bodies of law are doing little, if not nothing, to protect the deep volume of the oceans from planned and current industrial activities. And here you can see these projections of the Earth, including a section cut that runs into two columns, where that begins to expose you to the various domains and eventually sciences that can begin to inform our understanding of the Earth. We're zooming into the Pacific Ocean and in particularly to the site of the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, which is an area approximately the size of Europe that has the world's largest deposits of deep seabed rare earth minerals. Things are necessary for our batteries, alloys, cell phones, digital culture more generally. Since 2001, 12 exploration licenses for minerals have been granted on the CCZ deep seabed. And that's what you see, the smaller, rigid property lines. Paradoxically, if you look at the dotted squares, these are what are called the areas of particular environmental interest. The dotted squares are designated to protect biodiversity, ecosystem functions, and the sustainability of resources. And they're very kindly occurring at the sides where the valley in that moment of the deep sea becomes challenging for any exploitation to happen. They're also geometrically spectacular in a volume of the oceans where the waves make it very difficult to conceive of a fixed form, but detail. So what the Pacific Aquarium project begins with is a conceptual diagram. And this is the 9 squares that you see in bold to the right. The conceptual diagram proposes to collapse the extraction zones, the rigid, smaller leases, with the dotted squares. And rather than neatly separating the interests of industrialization from those of preservation, the project consolidates the 9 proposed environmental zones and overlays them onto the space of the concession. It obliges us to look at the Frankenstein moment in the face. This is not either nature or technology, this is the cyborg. So, to begin to reckon with that image of the cyborg is to be able to engage in a language that is more akin to the challenges that will be engaging us, and that are engaging us and will continue to engage us. So the installation is a grid of 9 modules, each of which embodies these contradictory concerns of ecology and economy within the same body of water. It's an uneasy cohabitation, but maybe it's a necessary intellectual exercise. The drawings will depict 3-dimensional cross sections of the ocean. There are 9, but I'll only share a few for the sake of this talk. The first one is the hanging gardens. With the support of international organization, this 21st century rush is set to begin on the ocean floor, the likely consequences of which may include changes to the geochemistry of the sediment, as well as light and noise pollution from the machinery. The same ICA has also mandated a detailed procedure in order to conserve the fauna and the flora of the mining region. So each mining entity here will be required to extract substrate samples along a geographically indexed system of transects on a 500-meter grid along its claim. They'll remove the topsoil. Suspended by cables from a grid of superficial floats, this terraforming infrastructure relocates the transects to incubate a new ecosystem that will be grafted back onto the depleted seabed once mining is completed. Similarly to its Babylonian namesake, the Hanging Gardens of the Pacific is the subject of controversies as to whether it's actually a construction or a poetic meditation. Meanwhile, the sharply toothed, comb-like suction machine churn and rip the ocean surface into sediment flurry, which, if not contained, would distribute widely through deep ocean currents. Here, a catchment dome leaves the Buckminster Fuller Dome of Manhattan and migrates to cap mining activities on the ocean floor to contain the sediment plume. The polluted water is separated from the surrounding ocean. It's transported into a series of inverted water towers for treatment and gradually released back into the ocean after purification. Below, the water tower flips Manhattanism on its head. Rather than architecture protecting the air of the city from the world, here both architecture and infrastructure are put to do work for the planet. The Cyborg fish colony. The International Seabed Authority mandates the conservation of the flora and fauna in the mining area of the Clipperton Zone. Deep-sea mining, however, produces such plumes that smother near-bottom species and forces them away from their habitats. The Cyborg fish colony is a school of worker fish, a hybrid of machine and organism, not dissimilar to the many killing machines and robo-fishers already ruling the oceans. Its purpose, however, is different. It collects plumes into a massive spherical sponge-like nest where toxic particles are regurgitated into what some imagine as an Anthropocene caviar-like delicacy. This model of ecology is comic, but it in a way also lethal. The Medusa Maze. Wherever coral reefs, sea turtles, and fish die off, jellyfish bloom. More than just symptoms of weakness, more like the angel of death in the oceans. The Medusa Maze is a jellyfish husbandry scheme for an emerging cosmetic industry. It's populated with planktons and sea turtles, the predators and the prey that are necessary for the jellyfish. The Medusa Maze is a husbandry that collects collagen from jellyfish in a response to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization's invitation to curb the widespread of jellyfish and to develop some useful formulations. The maze is also an arena that pits these gelatinous beasts against their predator in a very luminescent aquarium. The damnatio ad bestias of the Romans applied to the violence of the 21st century. The industry resolves this ecological nuisance in the forms of what are thought of as products, which are the more acceptable forms of slow violence once they're internalized into the economy. The Parliament of Refugees. The challenge of governing the ocean is that it lacks formal representation, a representation that it lacks both political and aesthetic representation, through which we can begin to think of new environments of climate change. The Parliament of Refugees is one such representation that contains within the same artificial envelope different things: the sea turtles, the scallops, the bleached corals, the drowning wetlands, the hammerhead sharks, algae, Homo sapiens. It's organized around a hollow pillar that connects it to the center of the earth through a submerged volcano. So the aquarium reckons with the cognitive and affective dissonance between what feels like a visceral individual concern and an impact and a context of enormous collective responsibility. It also presents a few other significant attributes. Differently from a two-dimensional representation, the aquarium is always a three-dimensional territory that invites us to think of volume. It's always a cross-section. And that allows us to shift our concern in terms of the oceans and climate change beyond the rising sea level concern that haunts all the major cities that lie on the coast, all the major coastal cities, and tells us that the impact of climate change is to be understood three-dimensionally on the volumes of the oceans. The aquarium is also always multi-species. The tiny little redfish here are an acknowledgement to that. It counters some of the images that present to us a territory of emptiness, such as the infamous Lewis Carroll evacuated ocean chart, to remind us of all the other life forms that inhabit the oceans. The aquarium is also a space of the now, and that now is important to respond to the accelerated and exponential aesthetics of infograms, satellites, and flyover images, to begin to ask us to stay in the moments of slowness, maybe to begin to reckon with the slow violence beyond the spectacular images. It's a form of maybe slow media that slows down thought and grounds it in the immediacy of the present. And the aquarium is also there. It's a model of the word that capitalizes on the distance from the real. It has no obligation, it has no scientific obligation to be a realist representation of what lies beyond it. It's an assemblage, it's a construction of an environment with clearly defined boundary conditions, where one can imagine monsters and storms and jellyfish together on stage, one in which one can imagine the non speaking and the non human entities that begin to operate as these devices of uncanniness, to begin to disturb, startle, delight us into ways of thinking and feeling the scales of the ocean. So it holds vividly that tension between the panorama and the detail. It's a slice of the ocean, but always a slice that embodies various scales from the micro to the macro that never fit very neatly. The third section is the planetarium. Extraplanetary geographies have become a matter of crucial legal and political importance, with the many emerging private space initiatives that speculate in potential extractive industries for water or platinum groups in the various space bodies. One can imagine somehow the manifest destiny or the gold rush going cosmic. Commercial actors are increasingly invested in surveying and sending exploratory missions to map and visit such astronomical rocks, such as here the Planetary Resources, which aims to send swarms of low cost robotic spacecraft to extract resources from the near Earth asteroids. In February 2018, Elon Musk's Tesla Roadster and its dummy driver Starman made headlines when the car blasted off to a David Bowie space oddity with a symbolism of a dashboard screen displaying "Don't panic," resonating with what the billionaire entrepreneur has foregrounded about worries regarding the next extinction and his thoughts that humans need to get off Earth and become interplanetary. with plans for the ecological colonization of Mars, which you can remember the film Martian, which apparently Elon Musk thinks it's worth seeing. So it's an invitation to live vertically the Earth, to exit the Earth. Bruno Latour would have a very strong response to such desires to abandon the planet fantasies and reminds us that we are very much down to earth, that we are grounded in the terrestrial and ought to continue to consider that. So, how do we acknowledge the multiple scales of the earth while engaging our territorial condition? In such visions of extra planetary mining or extra planetary exodus, outer space is no longer the common heritage of mankind, as it is declared by the UN Outer Space Treaty of 1967. It becomes an extension of private corporations' politics on Earth. So, how do we think of climate change in such imaginary that is being negotiated in such legal frameworks that are being revised? Cosmorama is Design Earth contribution to the US Pavilion Dimensions of Citizenship at the 2018 Venice Biennale. It charts the territories of outer space in three geostories that speculate on the expansion of empire and private industry into this previously called province of all mankind, and the way speculative efforts will impact life on spaceship Earth today. The geographic fictions here organized vertically from the left, mining the sky. The second one is the Planetary Arc, and the third one is the Pacific Cemetery. Begin to engage such narratives of technology and the frontier in the space age. Aside from daunting logistics, the largest earthbound obstacle to space mining is the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which then, mindful of Cold War animosity, had declared that no celestial body is subject to national appropriation, and I quote, by claim of sovereignty, by means of use or occupation, or by any other means. End of quote. Such universal legal geography has been recently violated by the national commercial space legislation, including one in the US called the US Space Act of 2015. SPACE as an acronym for Spurring Private Aerospace Competitiveness and Entrepreneurship Act. I think they started with the acronym and then had to figure out the longer version, but in all case, the Space Act of 2015 allows US citizens to engage in the commercial exploration and exploitation of space resources. So mining the sky speculates on such a landscape. In this drawing, the architecture of the new space age, it makes visible the intertwined and conflicting interests which bring together the United States Oval Office, the President's Office, the United Nations, its multiple decrees, the space industry, emerging and historical, and the private interests speculating on futures, as well as the sciences that are mapping, sending exploratory missions. It's a complex system that involves multiple actors, and to begin to address it requires that we understand the architecture of actors. So the captured asteroids are despun and they're towed to a mining depot at a point between the Earth and the Moon called the Lagrange point. It's a position where the combined gravitational pull from the Earth and the Moon could constitute a stable equilibrium point. So whatever is placed there could stay there without engine power. Robotic arms process the asteroids. They either hollow out the space resources, the valuable minerals, and they collect the trail of debris in the fabricated cave, or they mine the surface to carve out the face of some new gods of the new space age. So the cosmic Rushmore is an exploitation of such raw material that carves out a constellation of large-scale sculptures of the gods of private interest. This mission is a partnership between NASA and the US Air Force and maintains the security of these rare earth Lagrange points. You'll note the axonometry, which has a history as a technical drawing of being an instrument for militarization and security. So the fortification as at the Lagrange point, when looked at from the Earth, becomes the first artificially visible constellation to the human Earth, to the human eye on Earth. The second series is Planetary Arc. It's a collection of living animals, both those that were launched into space on scientific missions, the infamous Laika story, these animals that were sent to test the survivability of spaceflight for the human body, although it was very well known that most of these animals will not return. So these are embarking on the Empire State Arc and they're lining up the top of the image. They're also joined by a variety of other species that are currently threatened by the sixth mass extinction in Earth history. They're parading from the different domains of the Earth and also queuing up for that state arc to depart. Now that climate change and uncertain futures define a new normal on Earth, these animal species are sent out, each in its cubicle, to the International Space Station. It's the most expensive piece of infrastructure set to be decommissioned in 2024. Once funding for this institution is discontinued, the International Space Station is repurposed into a microcosm of scientific experiments on forms of life. Maybe a long winded way of saying a laboratory of what it means to be humans and how do we make worlds. The laboratory is also a place of last refuge where some scientist whose research funding on climate change has been discontinued and barred from websites can tend to creatures with remarkable care. A few thousand years later, the offspring of these fellow traveler, the various life forms of humans and other than humans, embark on an earthbound journey to Earth. They head towards Point Nemo in the Pacific Ocean, where the Pacific Cemetery is a vortex spiral island where decommissioned satellites and other space debris are brought back from orbit and recycled. Over the next decades, thousands of satellites will be launched into space and eventually decommissioned after 15 years of operation. This is currently where most of the spacecraft is deorbited because it's understood to be further away from points of inhabitation, terrestrial points of inhabitation. It's dubbed the Oceanic point of inaccessibility. It's roughly 1,400 nautical miles from the nearest land, and by land, they don't account for the many Pacific islands. It's already the cemetery of multiple deorbited spacecraft, including the Soviet-era Mir, a space station, the Jules Verne ATV, and other European Space Agency cargo ships, as well as a recent SpaceX rocket. In 1947, as the Second World War was wrapping, the US secured an agreement with the United Nations in which, by designating the islands of Micronesia as a strategic trust territory, the US could conduct nuclear testing in such sites between 1946 and 1962, with the disclaimer that the US should promote the economic advancement and self sufficiency of the inhabitants, and to this end shall protect the inhabitants against the loss of their lands and resources. It's an interesting historical precedent to draw onto, especially when many of these low lying coastal countries are now vulnerable to sea level rise, and the loss of physical territory implies not only the loss of the land upon which their houses rest, but also the loss of the countries to which they're citizens of. Because the UN criteria for statehood requires the presence of a physical territory. The first submerged Pacific Islands could become a US strategic territory for this new space age, which, not unlike the Marshall Islands, where the US buries its space trash and continues to emit huge quantities of CO2, all while promoting the said economic advancement and right to self-determination of such planetary refugees. The Point Nemo is the landfill of the space age, in which the vestige of space objects are recycled into bits of territory, bits of sovereignty, to house climatic refugees from the Pacific Island. In the installation, each suspended head is a Janus phase of a 3D model of an asteroid from the NASA open website, combined with a related Greek god, often which it bears the name. So the miniature meteorite is both a thing of science and a thing of mythology, not unlike Gaia. And Cosmorama is the site of spectacle. Similar to earlier image machines, the panorama, the diorama, the Cosmorama is a form of popular entertainment, a peep box through which the spectator views a set of scenes that put the cosmos on stage. So Cosmorama hacks the spectacle myth machine to render sensible the uncanny of the new space age and the Anthropocene. In the context of histories of the environment, myth is a particularly effective means for storytelling in times of trouble. Myths connect to and magnify the cultural and political worlds they engage. Like most stories, they come at truth through the imagination. They describe or explicate a here and a now that is difficult to tell and to hear in other ways. Myths counter the stories of industrial capitalism with an even more fantastic narrative machine that tells truth to realism. They ascribe agency where it's hard to assign causality. The importance of such wonder charged narratives should not be overlooked when conceiving planetary relationships anew. After all, environmentalism is foremost a protest on behalf of values, an engagement with the world beyond the tunnel vision of resourcism. In her posthumously published The Sense of Wonder from 1965, Rachel Carson encouraged her reader to consciously cultivate habits of awe, to pay careful attention to the overlooked beauties and mysterious rhythms of the natural world. We look too hastily, she lamented. People everywhere are desperately eager for whatever will lift them out of themselves and allow them to believe in the future. Stay in the now. Look at what's there. It's tempting to think that an attention to wonder and stories could eventually make us care. Thank you.
Temos de bater palmas. Thank you, Rania. Thank you so much for this presentation. We will be opening the question period, question and answers. I have some questions to start and to warm up. And I would quote, and some quotes from Geostories. As you point out, the crisis we are living is more about the modes of representation through which society relates to the complexity of environmental systems. And with Geostories, you propose an architecture with externalities, as you said, that brings into representation those things, spaces, and scales that are erased from the geographic imagination. Do you think architecture can reinvent itself by reconceptualizing its relationship with nature, admitting that nature defines the logic of survival? What kind of feedback or things have you reached after Geostories and after these?
It's a very generous proposition, I feel, to invite architecture to, if not reinvent itself, but to allow for the multiplicity of voices that it engages. Maybe one can be optimistic and say that architecture has always been a house for multiple voices. I think the project is a cultural project. I am at some point an architect by training, and I operate through the tools of architecture. My ambition is for, it's even more optimistic, is for humanity to reinvent itself. And I think that's the invitation that Bruno Latour invites us in Geostories as a term that's not necessarily disciplinary. It's a term that invites philosophers, scientists, lawyers, entrepreneurs, architects to engage a possible other world. And it so happens that architecture as a cultural practice could be part of that project. So maybe it's maybe I've been reading on the compost recently, and the kind of the humus as a root that is shared for human humility. So maybe it's a very humble project to imagine that humanity could reinvent itself. It's an imperative, we're reminded, and it's an imperative we're reminded with a ticking clock and an invitation to actually be part of a transformation. So hopefully, well, for now, we're engaged in architecture. We're recruiting architecture to be part of this humanity project.
Thank you. You also say that architectural drawing is a device that brings the earth into matters of concern, taking after Bruno Latour. It makes visible absent things, synthesizes sciences and scales of knowledge and complex environmental issues, and engages actors in scales otherwise unaddressed. What worlds do you expect to reveal with this poetic taxonomy of geostories? And maybe you started to point out.
Yeah, I mean, so maybe to put into context the invitation of Bruno Latour and his thought, as well as maybe some recent elaboration of these shifts. So Bruno Latour invites us to shift the way we look at the world, and particularly at technology and projects, away from matters of fact to become matters of concern. So he says, with every new project, the questions are already formulated, and we're expected to believe in the new iteration or version as the thing that will respond to the question. The challenge with matters of concern is to begin to show the bigger machine of which the answer is only a part, the emerging part of a bigger system, and to so learn to ask the right questions, so that things are not just peripheral or infra-visible, but they become the things we're concerned about. Some recent kind of feminist speculative ethics have invited us to shift from matters of concern to matters of care as a project. That apparently concern and the kind of enlightenment projects of being aware of things has proved not to be sufficient with questions as complex as climate change. So the quest now is, how do we devise a representational machine that allows people to care, in which there's a visceral invitation for these questions to actually resonate, and to resonate beyond the short attention span of whatever disaster of the moment is in the headlines. The fires of California, the burning of Amazonia, the flooding of the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, what other narrative strategies, what other worldviews could we provide for people to care more, care differently, care towards an objective?
You say axionometric stands for typological planetary imagination, and also can represent a planetary collective consciousness. It also makes totality thinkable, an impossible view for a mere mortal, but a necessary outlook to reckon with the cognitive and affective dissonance of climate change. What could architecture be doing that is still not doing?
So that's a great question on representation, because I think there's often a question of what choices in terms of representation, and what do these choices embody as worldviews. You will see that a lot of the projects in geostories adopt a section view on the Earth. And I think the section is important in our work, because rather than starting from the Earth as one and imagining a one response, we begin from landing somewhere. We begin all the projects from a very situated geography, be it the Persian Gulf, be it the CZZ in the Pacific Ocean, and begin to address the history and present of these transformations, as well as the imagined projected futures. So we begin from a very situated narrative, and we use the section as a way to engage the multiple elements of that narrative. We do understand, however, that many of these issues are not confined to the site in questions because of the systemic nature of much of these technologies. Because oil only exists because it's globally connected. It doesn't follow geography, it follows geology. And the companies go where the geology takes them. And it lands there, but it needs to ship back its resources to refineries and eventually cities. So the system of oil is by nature, is by design planetary. And so we need a kind of a tension in the representations that begin to capture the situatedness of a site as well as the global connectedness of that site, the planetary connectedness. And this is why the axonometry becomes an important ally, because it allows you to see a more expansive view and to begin to imagine other sites that a viewer, a reader might be more familiar with, to begin to examine through the lens of the Persian Gulf other transformations that might be happening in the Sahara, in Siberia, in the North Sea, in the Alberta tar sands, and begin to question the transformations that are happening in these multiple geographies once you've allowed for that axonometry to take you into a systemic representation. So it's a tension between the system and a node in the system, between the axon and the section.
Thank you.
I feel like I'm quizzed. Like, did I pass?
Yes. We
Okay.
are opening to questions to the audience. And does anyone want to start with some questions for Rania? Don't be shy.
I don't see you. I see Lucinda and the beautiful green that is shining, but I don't see what's happening on the other side of the room. So
We have some audience here, but they are very shy. They don't want to open the... Okay. So I would make more questions. If there's a question here. Okay.
Hello? Okay. So, thank you for the presentation. The drawings are beautiful. I'm very happy that I came to the museum to be able to see them in a large scale instead of seeing them on my small computer. And your proposals, they, for me, how I saw them, they act as devices or as industrial machines as a way of humans being to act and interact with nature to preserve it or to establish a new kind of relation. But I would like to hear your opinion about how that could become an inhabitable space, how we would interact with those devices, and how will they allow us to also interact with the new natures that you are creating and the new relations and economic proposals that they also bring on. So it's a revolution in our relation with nature and also a social revolution that you are proposing. It's the new cosmology for humankind. And I would like to hear something about how we would use those spaces, because we understand how they can be existing, but what kind of spaces do you see as spaces for humans to use?
thank you, and thank you for joining the lecture. I'm glad that you pointed to the size, literally, of these drawings, because I forgot to mention that most of these drawings are roughly a meter by a meter. So it's hard to communicate them in the kind of thumbnail of Instagram or on the computer screen, which is okay, because I think there's many scales at which they could be read, and that's and many symbolism that might lie there. But it's true that it's good to be able to engage them at a larger scale. I love your invitation. I love the way in which you're telling us that it's true that these projects are devices. They're devices, they're narrative devices that invite us to interact and then act on the world. And they're also projects. If you imagine the landform monument for the Age of Oil that rests on Das Island, then you're engaged with the legacy of the earthwork movements and their capacity to engage the kind of the Robert Smithson imaginary of the multiple materials of the earth as potentially, and the kind of the debris of the earth as new matter through which one could begin to form new sites. So I think they're an invitation to the matter with which one can begin to imagine architecture. If we think of the Das Island project, the one that holds the ground, you can think of very local strategies. That project, for example, draws on a local technology called Nabkha, which allows us to stabilize the ground in that detail and to hold on maybe not to the totality, but to a partiality of these islands. It's also an invitation to re-question some of the larger infrastructural projects of always the new megaport as a solution to these questions, and ask what kind of commissions, what kind of projects for the future that maybe begin to ask the very challenging questions of projects that are not growth driven, that are not always looking for the more, but could begin to present an appealing program for other economic paradigms. And I could think of the other projects of Pacific Aquarium, of Cosmorama in that case. I've wanted to diversify the sets so that we're literally touching on these different domains. But I think some of the work in geographies of trash and the project that was up in the mat, Trash Peaks, begin to think specifically of the agency of architecture to engage systems such as energy and trash in a way to begin to assert design as an ally for questions that are often thought to be very systemic. So, how do we think of the landfill as a site of design, of the sorting grounds, of the siting of various waste management facilities? And maybe that's because I'm based in a kind of a variation of a Polytechnic Institute recently. So I always feel that I need to answer to the questions of how do architects intervene in a world where most of the decision making so far has lied in the kind of harder engineering, design, sciences, and where can we begin to intervene within that? And I gravitate to imagine what forms of intervention could we have in the green projects of the world. So some of my work started by thinking of the Roadmap 2050 by OMA and imagining what kind of a future is always promised in the renewable energy future. It's always sunny. I mean, granted, some of it is in your part of the world, so the sun is not a fantasy. It's something you live. But people are always smiling. There's always a happy scientist carrying a younger child, and they're looking into the horizon to kind of an array of fields. But these fields are also often somewhere in the Sahara, somewhere further away. And that imaginary of externalizing the solar panel, which could be a very decentralized local technologies, persists in the way we imagine green solutions. So to me, the invitation is for architects to be part of what is now called the green in a way that acknowledges that we will live with these technologies. The only way for us to not to perpetuate design, obsolescence, rejection, and then the paradigm of massive disposal is that we begin to engage as architects from the moments in which the new is part of the question, so that we're not only asked to come in deindustrialized moments or in moments of kind of cleaning up the mess, but we're asked to be part of the conception of this territorial technological organization at the forefront, so that some of these questions of, well, these things have dimensions, they have specific materials. Once you deploy them, they will impact the way a larger area is organized. energy might relate to water concern, water at the surface, and how that's organized. It might relate to housing developments. So there's a series of questions that have often been kind of accidental or incidental to the agenda of architects. And maybe the desire is to be more engaged earlier on.
More questions? I have one. You show some of the work, some models. Did you manage to work with 3D models in the three Planetary, Terrarium, and Aquarium, or just for Aquarium, or was this kind of a work between drawing and modeling? Because when I saw the models, it suddenly became much more this idea that you are trying to pass of engaging is much more real, no? Because you have the reflections and they are in glass or in and it's very intense. Or how did you work out this process, this creative process?
That's a fantastic question. So the drawing does play. Let me just maybe quickly.
Because let me just say something. I was just thinking also because it's this is the process of our working as an architect, no, between the drawing and the model. Because what I think it's really interesting in this Imaginarium, that is the book, is that you are. It's much more behind the parametric thing because it could be kind of something of a medieval age, but at the same time, when you see the model, it's kind of a futuristic projection. So I kind of see this kind of time expansion while you were presenting, and that's why I was. And the work of an architect is also the project work process is like between drawing and modeling and going from one to the other. So I would like to hear a little bit more about your process. And
yeah. What about, do you want me to share my screen again and give you a...
Yes, of course.
Okay, I'll quickly grab the screen then. And it will take the usual. I'll have to go through, we're going to do it the first time. It's not going to work. I'm going to have to undo the input. Okay, voila. That doesn't work. I'm going to have to stop share. And then I'll go. How do we do that again? You. I don't know.
We are, yes,
present.
I think this is the last one, the last question.
Okay. And then.
Rania, just to say we are almost in our...
Yeah, no, I mean, I love the way you describe the models because they're exactly the way we think of them as architecture parlante, the artifact parlant, kind of a speaking artifact that they're often in their relationship to the models, in the relationship to the drawings, they want to speak to an audience. And so we often also resort to recognizable forms, and that's the Trash Pigs project that I wanted to kind of quickly refer to. Actually, let me just do, maybe this is an easier way to do it. Voila. So you get a quick sense of the drawing, which in itself is a traditional Korean folding screen pattern that shows the mountains that surround the city. But here they become these various cyborg creatures that the new features of the landscape. Now, what you don't see here, and I briefly showed it, is the series of models that are part of this exploration. So this project starts from, like, it has multiple drawings, each of which is developed in that section axonometry logic, but then they come back together into an image of the totality, and they come back in an installation form. And I think that's, if we are to think of a design research method, we kind of and the way we've developed it for geographies of trash, and the kind of same accelerated pace for us continues to be construct, represent, project, and assemble. So the idea of an assembly, of a public installation that is at the same time two-dimensional and three-dimensional is core to this project. I haven't showed much images from the after oil, but the models are there and their reflection on the soil, on the ground. Trash Peaks is core to that. Pacific Aquarium you've seen. The Cosmorama has these 3D printed heads, meteorite that you wander between. And the final piece is an actual meteorite from the Museum of Natural History. So you're kind of working between these various samples and representations of the world. So the assembly, the public kind of installation with the role of the drawing and the model is key to this project, yes.
Yeah, it's kind of a process, complex process.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, we are
Oops.
now in our limit. I would like to thank you so much, Rania, for this presentation. We send you by email some photographs of the public. We have a lot of people here assisting.
Thank you.
They are shy, but they are here. Thank you so much.
Are you sure this is not like what the comedy shows now do? Like they film in a room and they have like a background with some voices in the background. Like that could work too.
I'm sure.
All right, Lucinda.
So thank you so much. And,
Thank you for getting me out of my work and of dreaming of being with you on the other side of the Atlantic.
When this pandemic moment stops, we don't know if it will.
I'm happy to launch the counter-architecture conversation and we'll follow up on the next events and on later conversations. Keep in touch. Be well, all of you.
I just want to say that the next part, the roundtable following our short intermission, will be in Portuguese, but it will be translated to English. So if you want to follow, you are very welcome. Thank you so much. I'm just presenting that the roundtable will be moderated by Alexandra Paio. Alexandra Paio is an architect. She has a master in urban design and a PhD in architecture and urbanism from ISCTE. She's teaching at ISCTE, and she's also scientific coordinator of Digital Fabrication Laboratory, Vitruvius Fab Lab from University of Lisbon, and has some research published in digital architecture area, computational design, process and digital tools to support design. We are going to make a short intermission. We'll be back at 6 to have a coffee and to rest a bit. And thank you so much, Rania. Please stay with us. See you soon.
Pois é. O mundo não cessa de girar e os homens continuam a interrogar-se sobre o seu destino, sobre as causas e sobre os efeitos, sobre a justiça e sobre a responsabilidade, sobre o bem e sobre o mal, sobre a vida e sobre a morte, sobre as suas crenças e sobre aquilo que os impede de crer. E quando é que surgem estas interrogações? Sempre. Não. Apenas nos momentos em que os homens são assaltados por dúvidas. Naqueles momentos de crise, quando se sentem ameaçados, quando sabem que não podem evitar um olhar à sua volta. É assim. O medo guia a nossa capacidade de compreendermos um mundo que, de repente, se tornou estranho. Subitamente, é como se as nossas certezas tivessem sido engolidas por uma realidade que já não quer saber de nós. E porquê que isto sucede? Pois. Porque se calhar nos portamos mal. Sigam lá o meu raciocínio. Acham que o mundo, este simpático planeta cujos recantos mais inacessíveis já conseguimos ocupar, começou de súbito a querer fazer-nos compreender que afinal ele não foi criado para nos divertirmos? Então, porra, isto não é tudo nosso. Andam para aí a dizer que não podemos matar, devorar, transformar tudo aquilo que quisermos. Os animais, as plantas, a água, as rochas, deixaram de ser protagonistas no cenário desta nossa brincadeira universal? Porquê é que a malvada da natureza se voltou contra nós? Porquê é que ela quer impedir que acreditemos naquele nosso sonho recorrente de sermos os reis deste mundo todo, do universo até? Será que descobrimos que, afinal, não passamos de uns símios tontos e malcriados que danificam tudo aquilo em que tocam? Os jornais e a televisão vomitam quase todos os dias notícias calamitosas relacionadas com a fome, com as alterações climáticas, com as doenças, com a poluição, com as radiações perigosas ou com a possibilidade de deflagração de guerras. Mas que diabo! Por que é que nos meteram na cabeça que quem mandava aqui éramos nós, quando afinal o nosso poder aqui é bem precário? Será que o sonho de um paraíso terreal, que também nunca deixámos de alimentar, se desvaneceu para todo sempre? Olhamos para a paisagem e percebemos os traços da nossa presença como uma espécie de contaminação. Deixámos de ser bonitos, Xissa. Deixámos de ser virtuosos. Deixámos de ser saudáveis. Deixámos de cheirar bem. A nossa ciência, afinal, não sabe tudo. Não pode tudo. Pois é. A nossa própria sobrevivência enquanto espécie animal tornou-se bem incerta. Ai, que chatice. Que incómodo. Chega a ser insultuoso até ter consciência que estas ameaças pavorosas são reais. E onde se manifestarão elas? Apetece-nos perguntar. Nos atuais palcos de guerra? De fome? Em algum país martirizado de outro continente? Longe da civilização? Ou pelo menos longe dos centros urbanos? Nos bairros periféricos de alguma cidade cosmopolita? Não. 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 3 vezes não. O que se irá passar? Passar-se-á aqui, no espaço dos nossos movimentos, nos lugares que nos são familiares, cujos contornos já memorizamos e que nos dão a sensação de pertencermos a um sítio, que nos permitem sentir o doce aconchego de um abrigo, mas que afinal não nos conseguem abrigar, porque o fantasma do que aí vem já aqui está. Derramou-se como uma sarna invisível que não respeita hierarquias, mentalidades, credos, nem privilégios económicos, nem mesmo o poder irresistível que vem de par com o sucesso. Não poderemos pagar para que a coisa aconteça pelo menos longe do sítio onde habitamos. A resposta já a sabíamos de antemão. Um não categórico e definitivo. É incrível! É imoral! É grotesco, é revoltante. Então, e daqui a quanto tempo é que mergulharemos nesta obscenidade? Daqui a 1000 anos? Não. 500, vá. 100? 50? Não. Nem o espaço de uma geração. Já aqui está. Mas o que mais nos assusta é não sabermos onde é que isto tudo vai dar. Os efeitos do que já está a acontecer são imprevisíveis. Como é possível, numa sociedade civilizada como a nossa, termos chegado a esta situação? Digam-me. Mas porquê é que não fomos avisados a tempo? Porquê é que fomos tratados como se fôssemos os outros? Como se fosse impossível descortinar um sentido na evolução biológica da nossa espécie? Como se, ao fim e ao cabo, a face de Deus não resultasse de uma média estatística idealizada das nossas faces caucasianas, de expressão serena, benevolente, irradiando esmagadora beleza. E pronto, não digo mais nada. Porque, atenção, a delicadeza é tudo aquilo que nos resta depois de termos posto em leilão todas as outras virtudes da civilidade. Depois de tudo isto, ficou-nos apenas a delicadeza. Num gesto de nos coçarmos para aliviar a sarna do devir. O que é aquilo ali ao longe? Uma cidade? Onde é que estão os palácios de cristal? Onde estão as cúpulas douradas? Onde estão os pórticos de pedra que ornavam as ruas? Os parques luxuriantes? Vejo ruínas e fumo de fogos. O príncipe onde está? Sob os escombros. Soterrado. Fugiu? E pode-se fugir disto? Para onde?
Aumentar um tiquinho o volume porque eu tenho algo.
Eu vou dizer isso. Já estive ali a escrever umas coisinhas.
Sim.
Vamos começar? Quando quiserem, eu começo. Digam-me ok. Ok? Muito boa tarde a todos, os que estão online e os que estão de forma presencial. Temos aqui uma assistência, portanto, que muito nos agrada nestes tempos em que não podemos estar todos juntos, portanto, é muito importante termos aqui uma audiência vasta. É com enorme satisfação e prazer que estou a moderar esta primeira conversa de realidade e fantasia, uma dimensão psicológica. Obrigada, Lucinda Correia, e obrigada ao Mate por esta oportunidade de debater um tema tão complexo, provocatório, inspirador e pertinente para a arquitetura contemporânea, com um painel tão diversificado, multidisciplinar, e que é fundamental esta multidisciplinaridade, esta diversidade, para que se possa, de alguma maneira, atingir um conhecimento que é também uma reflexão, e uma reflexão que é partilhada, e sempre com um grande objetivo, ou que eu gosto de dizer sempre que tem um grande objetivo, que é pensarmos o bem comum. Saúdo o painel desta mesa, Viriato Soromenho Marques, que infelizmente não vai poder estar
Soromenho
presente.
Marques, unfortunately, is not present, but he will. He sent the video. Miguel Mendes, Ferreira Mendes is on my left. Pedro Matos Soares on my right, Susanna Fonseca, she's online, and she will be with us virtually during this debate. We will all be able to speak about diversity and certainties we have in these times of change and evolution. These are times of transformation and evolution. It's important to bear in mind the need for reflection. You can join us. Those of you online and those of you present here may ask questions. This talk will be enriched with your questions, and that is very important. Those questions are very important to feed our debate during these 2 hours. I will briefly present the panel, the members of the panel. Viriato Surumenho Marcos is a full professor of philosophy at the Faculty of Arts at the University of Lisbon, corresponding member of the Lisbon Science Academy and the Navy Academy. He's the author of a vast bibliography on philosophical, environmental, and political strategic themes. He has been intensively investigating the European crisis, the role of federalism in the search for new governance models for the global crisis of the environment and the climate. He has a regular collaboration in the written and audiovisual press. Miguel Ferreira Mendes, an architect by the University Lusíada of Lisbon and the architecture Faculty of Milan. He has a specialization in architecture and biosphere by the San Francisco Institute in the United States. Another one, another postmaster in earth architecture. He's an independent architecture. He favors a bioclimatic and humanist approach to architecture based on valuing local building cultures under a sustainable development perspective to defend and promote participatory approaches and processes, working on architectural design, training, technological consultancy, and is responsible for development of several projects in Portugal and abroad, Angola, Algeria, Burundi, Cape Verde, France, Guinea-Bissau, among others. He's a member of Crater, the French laboratory. He works with Crater on several projects and the founding member of Centro da Terra in response to catastrophes. Under the scope of architecture and construction, is the member of Centro da Terra Foundation. Pedro Matos Soares is a lead researcher at the Dom Luís Institute, a visiting professor at the Department of Geographic Engineering, Geophysics and Energy, both at the Faculty of Sciences of the University of Lisbon. His doctorate in physics focused on turbulence and clouds in atmospheric models. Over the past decade, he focused his research efforts on climate modeling, climate change, renewable energy, sustainability, and currently he leads a research group on climate change, atmosphere, earth, oceans, processes, and extremes at the IDL of the University of Lisbon. Pedro published over 80 scientific papers in the international journals and has given hundreds of conferences and outreach presentations. Finally, Susanna Fonseca. She has a PhD in sociology by ISCTE, University of Lisbon. She was a researcher in the area of sociology of the environment and, more recently, at ICS, also University of Lisbon, for more than 2 decades. Susanna is a founder and member of the board of Zero, an association, environmental association. She coordinates sustainable societies and new forms of economy area, and she's a current collaborator. She's a part of the group of founders of Copernico, the first renewable energy cooperative in Portugal, where she is currently a member of the board of trustees. Now, we will open the discussion with a short video by Professor Viriato Soromeno Marques. He could not be with us physically, so he sent us a video, and let's watch the video. And the provocative words and questions raised by Professor Soromeno Marques. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to greet Lucinda Correa for this kind invitation to be with you, even though I cannot be physically. I would also like to greet the other participants in the panel, those that are attending this session. First of various four lectures. So, to be short, I have prepared a very brief presentation with the key ideas that I would like to convey. Let me share the screen with you. Can you see? I call this very brief presentation the cities and the imperative of a new housing of Earth. So under the scope of this subject, I thought that it was more appropriate to focus on a problem within the problem, which is how can we turn cities into factors of change, positive change. I mean, and the text, the introductory text goes beyond sustainability. It's sustainability and survival. That's what's at stake here. And I'd like to stress this. We are undergoing times in our historic process, an environmental crisis, in these times of Anthropocene, as we call it, lately, after Paul Crutzen's inspirational ideas in the year 2000. This is an acute stage of great acceleration, an entropic process that surprises us every day, and so we must be clear and say that this is the most serious subject of our lives. These are historical times. Unprecedented historical times. A first and brief note about what I call here the nature of cities. They are artificial creatures of historic acceleration. Whenever a human community is able to get into the urban level may change. We can consider that if we are in the Neolithic population of 2,000, 3,000 inhabitants is an urban population. And the urban phenomenon in the Neolithic had its breakthroughs, its drawbacks. We had a few concerns that, or certain issues that took thousands of years and then that they were interrupted. So there is a process of urbanization that has to do with its artistic nature. It's part of architecture, of the human action, and it allows for an historic acceleration. Hence, cities are also machines of civilization and anthropo-civilization. They are not just machines or systems of civilization at the level of the institutions, of the products, of the material culture, but they are also systems of education, of training of the human being. The city prepares civilized citizens and human beings for civilization. A third characteristic, the one that we are more concerned about in this global crisis of the 21st century, they are second-degree ecosystems. The cities create an association, a close association with ecosystems, with the natural elements, with the biosphere, and that is the main problem we have today. We have a second-degree ecosystem, civilizational ecosystem, which is dysfunctional, that devours resources, entropic, and that's a problem, because our survival depends on the opposite. We need a relationship of synergy and not degradation, a harmonization of complexities and not simplification. As far as cities and the history are concerned, of course, we can read history in different ways. There is a new branch of historiography these days, which is environmental history, which is very interesting to understand the history of mankind from the environmental dynamics, the relationship with the resources, land use management, how technology interacts with the environment. But there is an urban vision of history that is also fascinating. And an author that is very forgotten these days, the German thinker Oswald Spangler, he wrote a huge work, 4-volume work, The Decadence of the West, from 1919 to 1922. He proposes a non-linear version of history, a cyclical version of history. And it's interesting to note that cities work as indicators of apex and nadir. So he analyzes the global cultures, including, for instance, the ancient Egypt, the ancient Rome, antiquity, and our culture, what he calls today the Phostic culture, that started around 9th or 10th century AD, and the urbanization phenomenon is the time when the civilization attains its maturity and enters a process of the challenge for survival. Historically speaking, none of the major cultures he analyzes has survived. All those cultures perished and eventually led to, or gave rise to, different cultures. But our situation is different. We have a global culture today, and therefore, we have to be realistic enough and responsible enough to understand that today we wouldn't have the phenomenon of the fall of the Roman Empire. When Rome fell, Rome was the population of Rome and another 50 million people that lived in the territory of the empire. So when Rome fell, what happened was that, for instance, in China, another major culture, that phenomenon was irrelevant. Now, today, everything is interconnected, interdependent, regardless of the walls that certain prehistoric politicians out of the script try to build. No wall can ensure a protective insularity of anyone, least a nation. No one is totally protected. We are all vulnerable and interdependent. And a curious indicator is item 3 there, Rome and London. Rome was the first known city in the West to attain 1 million inhabitants during the Republic already, before 1 century before Christ. And then the population increased up to 1.2, 1.3 million until the 3rd century. Then, at the end of the 3rd century, the population decreased, and after the Roman Empire fell, Rome became much more relative, like a village with 4,000 inhabitants during the Middle Ages. And in Europe, we only had, again, a city with being called a second-degree ecosystem with 1 million inhabitants, with London. In the 19th century, 1800 and 1804, that's when London attained 1 million inhabitants. Now, you can see how cities are an indicator of the degree of the organization capacity. We needed 1500 years to resume what had been ended in Rome, still during the Roman Empire. So what is the point of the situation? Well, where are we now? We are in the Anthropocene, an interesting word, a word that makes us more responsible, amongst other things, but Anthropocene, in Paul Knudsen's proposal, would have started with the Industrial Revolution, 1750. Other authors, Will Steffen, for instance, an Australian scientist that worked with Knudsen, proposes a division of Anthropocene in three stages. The second stage is what he calls the Great Acceleration. The Great Acceleration starts right after the Second World War, 1945. And as a matter of fact, all that we think about today in terms of environmental impact, the non-organized way how humanity is dealing with Earth, all this intensified after 1945. It's impressive because major changes happened in the past 75 years. I would even say in the past 60 years. And one of the characteristics of this acceleration was an urban boom, but with two dynamics. We cannot confuse them. There is on one hand a dynamic of the Western countries, Western powers, so-called colonial powers, I call here central countries, a phenomenon of creating major cities that then become metropolitan structures and eventually urban networks. The most appropriate country to understand this idea is Germany. Germany does not have one mega city, but it has a mesh of cities, a lot of them with less than 1 million inhabitants, and it follows an historic pattern, which is a part of urbanization in Germany. And then we have another phenomenon that we can call mega urbanization that is dominating the urban landscape in the third world, what we used to call third world, the colonized countries, the peripheral countries, cities with over 5 million inhabitants, with over 10 million inhabitants. These phenomena are what I call here unbalancing centralization. These cities, they suck the natural and human resources. They absorb all that. The example of the city of Mexico is an extraordinary city, but it's difficult to find a city that in 30 years went from 2 million to 20 million inhabitants. It tenfold in 30 years. This is a phenomenon that shows that there is a growth pathology here. And now, towards the challenges that we are going to discuss in this panel, I think that we are in a very acute stage of the global environmental crisis. We are living the first planetary, the first global civilization, we have a stage that in the end of the 20th century, where networks of cities appear towards the environmental issues, sustainability, transfer of technologies, good practices, good urban practices, good management, even political practices. This was very positive. I call this period, it's no longer the period we are living now, as model of sustainability. So what we tried to do at the time was doing the same but better, more effectively, with better mobility, an urban mesh that allowed for less elastic dynamics, transport, displacements from, less commuting, energy and water efficiency, waste management that led to circular economy proposals, architectonic and solutions, but also in terms of material technology. This was a fundamental model to create subjects, critical mass, competencies, but now we are in a different stage. Climate, environmental, acute stage. Now it's no longer enough to do the same better. We have to do better but different. This is the main challenge. We need a new narrative, a new model to live together. As I said in the title of my paper, with a new model to inhabit Earth. And this is my last, or my before last slide. The risks, main risks. And then I will list a few answers that are being tried. But there is still a deficit of solutions, of answers. We are living a period when inspiration, innovation are crucial. We have now more problems at response capacity, and anyone who says otherwise is a fantasist. People of my age were educated by people that have had answers to everything. We lived in the best of the worlds. We would already be living in Pluto. Now we have to be humble, and that means recognizing that we are unable to provide an answer to most problems, vital problems we have, and we have little time to find these solutions. What are the risks? Climate risks. Heat waves are a main issue. In 10 years, we'll have a huge problem, which is the rise of the sea levels. The Portuguese cities, Lisbon, Setúbal, up north as well, and the Algarve, not so much in Madeira and the Azores. We'll have problems, and we have to find solutions. In certain cases, means we just have to let the sea rise, and in other cases, we have to find engineering solutions to allow for the harmonization with what we want, the structures we want to defend, and this inevitable rise of sea waters. Risks to the public health. The pandemic we are going through is the result of a rising number of zoonoses, diseases, transfer of biological material, viral material from human species to from animal species to the human species. And this is because mankind is taking over all habitats. We are taking over all available territory. We are removing species from their habitats. We are capturing the species and selling them in exotic animal markets, as it happens in China, but not just there. And the price is huge, as we can see. The cost is terrible. This is certainly not the last pandemic we will face. Then risks of lack of security in terms of provision of food. The cities are fragile structures, and they are very susceptible to what I call here the a fall in the markets. This is very common in the history of mankind. Cities depend on markets that go beyond the hinterland. They depend on markets that are in other countries, in other regions. Rome depended on the resources that came from thousands of kilometers away in the empire. And in the 20th century, we also underwent the fall of markets in a very clear way during the First World War, during the crisis of 29, during the Second World War. We had a little sample of what could be a fall in the market when the countries were fighting for the masks and Chinese ventilators. And we have to strengthen cities through the creation of markets, as I will say, that will allow to offset this difficulty.
And of course, we have other governance risks, the classic risks. What we witness is that in different parts of the world, governments are actually panicking. And we're talking about the US Federation. That reflects the sclerosis situation, and hence the cities have to review their role so as to prevent this crisis and to prevent an anarchy. And of course, we also are also faced with massive migratory risks. We are faced with organizational cohabitation problems, and these tend to increase more and more as these migratory movements increase. I'm going to conclude giving you some food for thought, some questions that we may reflect on. That is, in the future, the states will have to be able to not only provide some urban autonomy, but also at the same time to create more cooperation between them. The Roman Empire was actually that, a confederation of cities. So maybe this model will emerge in different countries in Europe. And I do believe that Europe can survive as a federation. If this is not the case, many countries, many European countries will not survive as states. And I'm not going to refer any specific countries, that we all know what I'm talking about. Also, we need to consider the creation of strategic markets, proximity strategic markets, meaning we have to provide the necessary food supplies to create jobs, to actually innovate in architecture, because how can we introduce agriculture in the urban meshwork? And this regardless of the fact that we may actually have it have farming elsewhere, but this is a challenge for architecture. ICTs will certainly have or can certainly play a role in promoting the development of hinterland. When we consider some places as sort of deserted areas, what we mean is that there is a lack of population. We are a rectangle in Portugal. It's only 150 kilometers from sea to the border with Spain. But the problem is that we somehow abandoned the territory, the inland territories. We sort of were seduced, so to say, by the paper pulp industry, and we somehow have managed to create some urban or some internal colony, which is dealt with in a very wrong way. Last but not least, cities will certainly be pivotal as factors for peace, for innovation, for cooperation, for resilience. We have to be very careful as we take steps forward. We are in a minefield. We're walking in a minefield. And so we need to get hold of all the necessary tools to prevent that. And I have very few certainties. But one thing I'm sure of, and that is if or while we have top politicians shouting out, about war, we will not survive. So we need pacifier, moderate politicians, and we may actually require different alliances, because these will certainly be crucial for innovation, cooperation, and resilience. Thank you very much for your attention. Well, thank you very much. the issues raised were certainly very important, because cities are obviously very important. The speaker has raised a number of issues that we may discuss further down the road and during this conference, and maybe now give some time to the audience to ask questions. I'll start with one. I don't know if Susanna is on. So let me start by asking Susanna the following question. And then the other members of the panel will be asked to answer to that. I mean, what is the role that each and every one of us has in devising solutions? As Viriato said, we need to rehearse, new methods, new paths, so as to overcome the hurdles that we're faced with, to overcome the needs for change, and we have to be aware of the fact that coming generations expect us to pave the way for them. And so, in view of all the realities that Viriato mentioned, what are we to do? I mean, are there any straightforward ways of changing without, trying to go back and forward? Because, again, this is very important for architecture. I believe that architects also need to think, to reflect on this, because this is crucial for their process of the making, so to say, as they're working. Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this conference. Unfortunately, I could not participate, personally participate in the conference. Of course, your question is certainly not easy. Let me start by saying that there is not one single way to actually, or one single path to address this problem. There are many paths, many ways we can follow to actually face the challenges we're faced with. Unfortunately, I could not hear Viriato's presentation. I'm sure it was brilliant as usual, but I think that, as I said, we need to find the different ways that we can follow, and starting by actually identifying the causes, the root causes of the problems. I work in the area of production and consumption, and of course I always tend to bring this topic, to discussions. So one of the things has to do with the climate change. What is the root cause for this? Or for these changes. So if we do not actually start by questioning how we produce, why we produce, the amounts we produce, the way things are produced, we won't be able to find the path or the paths to actually overcome or address the problems related to climate change. Of course, this has a whole array of implications in our society. When we're talking about production and consumption, if we change that, we'll change everything, basically. We're talking about reducing production, consuming differently, without actually having this causing a dire impact in our habits, our quality of life. But we, of course, have to keep in mind environment, because environment can live without us, so we cannot live without environment. So I believe that the path we've been following, it will certainly have to change in order to actually improve things. It's the fact that we have to address these issues has to do with self-protection, so to say. Because if we respect the limits imposed by the planet, then we will be ensuring that both our generations and the future generations, which certainly deserve our respect. So if we don't do things right, we won't be able to ensure the quality of living of both current and future generations. Of course, this entails obviously considering or challenging some aspects. Do we actually need to move from one place to the other constantly? Let's keep in mind the recent pandemic and the restrictions in movements that it has imposed, and now many of us have found that that we can actually work at home. And this somehow, of course, was very, very difficult, but we managed to test some specific situations. And I believe that we need to discuss this at societal level. That is, we can't have everything all the time. I believe that this is something that a company will have to convey or try to convey to customers. And science is also very important to somehow draft or draw this kind of roadmap that we are to follow. And on the opposite side, on the reverse side, we can see what will happen if we do nothing about it. What the crisis has helped us understand was to see that we could change things not from one day to the next, but from one week to the next. Of course, there were terrible impacts, but it's important that we consider or that we challenge what is actually necessary for us to feel well, and for somehow reduce or to reduce the climate changes. We have to keep in mind also the risks that we have. Several experts have drawn our attention to this fact, and this pandemic is a living example of what I just said. We have been invading specific areas that used to be used by other species, and this has somehow led to risks for us. And it's important to understand that science can actually give us the signs or give us the clues before we actually need them. So the problem is that we don't always pay enough attention to such clues. Again, I have not been able to directly answer your question, but I believe that the answer is we have to challenge, we have to question our living standards and what we've been using, or to do away with some of the things we were used to. move all the time from one place to another, we'll probably have more time for our family or for cooking or for doing nothing, which is something that, as we very well know, it's very important. People do not have enough time for themselves, and this has to do with people running and rushing and dashing to actually get more and more and more. So we need to somehow incorporate new ways or to devise new ways to position ourselves in society and to address the issue of the ecological footprint. In order to address this, of course, we will have to consider public policies. I mean, there has to be very clear public policies to address specific issues. People want, at large, they want to minimize their ecological footprints. But this means that people tend to pay more and to have less. So being sustainable today is more difficult than being and more expensive than being unsustainable. So if we don't change these views, if we don't change this type of attitude, then we won't be able to actually change the way or move along other paths. We sometimes look at other countries and consider that, oh, they do a lot better than we do. Well, we have to I believe that we need to work and to raise people's awareness and maybe not only challenge ourselves but also our family, our friends and our colleagues, because this way we will be able to do something. And I think this is all for now. Thank you very much, Susanna. I believe there is a new path, the idea of science. So, Pedro, do you think that there is a chance or there is a role for science to play, in the cities?
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank Lucinda for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here. Of course, science for decades has followed those paths, and this issue was identified more than 1 century ago. Since the 19th century, the number of scientific works on this problem identified that the problem of the greenhouse emissions could change our reality, as our protective layer, which is the atmosphere, is now under excessive heating and climate extremes. So that body of evidence, of scientific evidence, started in the 17th century, but achieved its peak with the characterization of the greenhouse effect in the 19th century, in the beginning of the 20th century. And then it was characterized and studied during the 20th century in great detail, but never followed by the capacity to communicate this problem to society as a whole. So science faced many obstacles, but it was also unable to show in a convincing way the problem that humanity was faced with. Interestingly, only in 2020, if we think about Portugal, this awareness, societal awareness of climate change, only has to do with phenomena that affect us directly. I work on the field for many years, and no one cared for many years. I can understand that you don't care about me, but only after 2017 and fires, the dramatic fires we suffered, then we did focus on this issue, and there was in Portugal even a political approach to an issue that we all knew about, that we were undergoing change in the Earth system. So science has been studying this reality for a long time, and with a diversity of scenarios. Fortunately, our scientific interdisciplinary environment, I'm a physicist myself, and physics took leadership, because it's based on physics that we create these systems of the Earth system. And I don't want to sound like a nerd, but we are able to build the evolution of the Earth system with these models. So thanks to these models, we are able to implement them and the different components of the Earth system, and we are able to build new realities, new narratives, what we call scenarios of development. Now, these scenarios of development for the past 30 or even 50 years, if I want to be even more drastic, the reality we have today, we are in a warming process, an Earth system which is more energetic, and associated to this system we have the triggering of extreme phenomena and their consequences, the most serious ones, which are the social consequences. This requires major changes in our development model, because this development model allows for the well-being of certain societies. Significant well-being is based on the fossil fuel emissions. So this is the general framework of the problem, and what science is responding with. Science today, it's not just physics and mathematics, but also sociology, mathematics, psychiatry. These days, all branches of science, of course, health as well, are concerned about this problem, and we have the capacity to build behavior models, human behavior, physical behavior of the Earth system, that allow us not strictly to portray the future, but to provide information about the new futures we may be faced with. So this is a decision-making tool, collective and individual decision-making tool. Let me stress that this 19th century, the fact that this dates back to the 19th century, it's very important to deconstruct the idea that still prevails in society, that this is a fad. People that somehow are avert to change, to radical change in society, usually they like to word, oh, that's a fad, that's sustainability, just a buzzword. Sorry. And interestingly, those very complex models that run in the supercomputers of the best universities in the world, in a business as usual scenario, they indicate that Earth, by the end of the century, will warm up 4 to 5 degrees. Renews in 1894, in the back of the envelope, made some calculations just with the relative simple, and they came to the same conclusion. So if we were to double the CO2 on Earth, we would have a warming of about 4 degrees. So when we speak about models or market impressions to have a different development, and this has to do with the new cities, new architectures, are being relatively ignorant, and we are trying to hide and to neglect the main problem we have to face as a society. So it's very important for us to be aware that if we analyze from Arrhenius to the models of the first model of the Earth system with the sphere, the Earth surface, whatever, we realize that models have certain weaknesses, but they do show what has happened, and they are confirmed by the observation of the Earth system the past 40 to 50 years, and they are coherent. So I would like this confidence, this trust to be extrapolated to other levels of knowledge. And so as creators of knowledge and civic intervention, we should be able to, and we should also have the fantasy to create models interdependent from the new realities towards something that is very simple. Our road, our path has a lot of elements. It's very complex, but the path is one and only one. We have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That's the way to go. I'm not wearing a mask, that's why I wanted to speak. I hate to speak with a mask, but we are in a situation of pandemic. We speak a lot, we spoke a lot, and we still speak again about the flattening of the curve. And since the 90s, we hear about the hockey stick chart, that growth chart, with a concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, which is similar to the number of cases during the first wave of the pandemic. Now we speak about flattening the curve, but we never wanted to care about flattening the curve of the climate change. Now we can no longer flatten that curve. Either we now cut down on the greenhouse gas emissions in a rather abrupt manner, but I mean it has to be very fast, or the consequences will be human. Earth system, the ecosystems, this is very worrisome. And it has to do with ourselves, and we have to become aware of this. And before closing, let me mention something relevant about the ingredients. We have to reduce CO2 emissions. We are aware that there are technologies that respond to a certain extent to this problem. We've had a remarkable development in production of energy, the main contributor to CO2 emissions in sphere. Renewables also entail problems about our articulation with the ecosystem. But technology does not suffice, and Susanna a while ago stressed this. We must have a different model for living. We cannot wait, as Susanna said, for a development model similar, growth models. And the Terrarium has the one we've had so far, thanks to fossil fuels, and then technologies will solve the problem. This change, as I said, has to be very sudden and quick. Technology we have today will help, but it is not the only answer. The answer is our behavior, individual behavior, our capacity or not to turn other people into behaving like that, to build a new model of behavior. Thank you. Thank you. Well, sociology, science, always this need to be different, to behave differently. Now, yes, Romano Marcus said, do we need a new model of living on Earth? How do you see this, ask you as an architect, how do you see this way of changing how we do that? Are there solutions that have been tested? What has been done in architecture? Are we aware of this? From the experience you've had, you've worked in so many spaces where resources are limited and are suffering the consequences of an over-consuming West. Well, there are always solutions and paths. I don't know where they lead to. Maybe, as Pedro said, architecture really can't do anything because architecture is an object of human creativity. Yeah, and men and women adapt and change their mentality. Architecture will not save them. Even science is a discovery of phenomena that are there already. But the architecture is a product of a creativity that belongs to us, that comes from us. So either we change the paradigm about how we live on Earth, how we are in the world. There are no technological miracles that will save us. And if we assume architecture as, I think, a discipline that is at the service of men and not the other way around, what we are asked to do, what we should do in architecture is provide physical, morphological spaces for this life to exist. We can make the most of it, we can condition it, whatever it entails. But it's mainly the mindset of the Western civilization that has to be questioned. Because this goes from the Judeo-Christian matrix. It says something like, and apologize for the lack of rigor, they say something like God created the earth and all things and then meant to control all that. This is a huge load over our matrix of participation in the biosphere. We come to the world with an attitude, an innate attitude that is determining. And then it goes on with the exacerbation of that feeling. That's my opinion. It's not so much from the scriptures, but more of a socio-political opinion. But neoliberal capitalism exacerbates that reality, that competitiveness. We are all the time being bombed with praises to our individuality. You can do it, you want, you have, you get. We own the world with just a few remotes. Pierre Rabhi, probably you have heard about him. He says something in a paper once, in the conference, once he's speaking about this history of boxes, the boîte in French. And he said, we all live in boxes because we work in companies. In French, it's boîte. We go to the nightclubs. In French, means boîte. We drive our cars. And in French slang, they say caisse or boîte. And finally, we end up when we die on a box, on a coffin, which is a boîte. So this shows the alienation of the human being before his neighbor, before his environment. Using a rather Cartesian expression, it's the turn towards himself. The human being is always turned towards himself, does not pay attention around him. Now, as regards the role of architecture, to try to be more objective and answer your question, I think there are at least three architectures. There is an architecture that serves the interests of real estate developers, builders, the market, so to speak. That's an architecture that can propose things, but it's a little bit hostage, unless you want to be on the outside, but then we'll follow the third type of architecture. I'll come to that. But it's rather hostage of this game about what has to be done, what is acceptable to do, what we have to do to be competitive, that terrible world competitiveness. And then there is another architecture which is totally subsidiary to the political power, an architecture of programs, construction programs. As Lucinda said, thank you, Lucinda, for having invited me. And as Lucinda said in her introduction, we invent this to live with this fantasy as a reality. So there is also this architecture, there are also these programs, rather pseudo-paradigmatic. And then there is a third architecture. It's the one that arrogantly I say I belong to, is the architecture of those that work with the world, the physical world and social world of things, people, to work with matter. And when I say working with matter, well, it fits anything. It's rather risky to say it, but work with materials, with culture, with people, places, the contexts. And to work with a rather transversal, cross-cutting vision of things. That's I started in architecture, political science, politics, art. Architecture alone cannot work. Either there is a global vision of things or it won't work. We have a sort of a default or a characteristic that makes us hide from reality and be happy with certain mitigations of reality. And we tend to replace phenomena or elements or factors instead of looking at the global vision, instead of considering the global vision. The problem is still there. It's as if the essential is totally a mess, but the superfluous is very tidy, very controlled, and it's unlimited. But we keep on playing with the superfluous and we cannot look at what is essential. And then we have examples. Maybe I'm going further than I should, but I thought about this example when I saw the program. We know a building called Antilia. I suppose that's the name. It's the highest private housing building in the world. It's in India, Mumbai. In Mumbai, we have what Paul Varela Gomes called human trash. And he made a very interesting comparison for us to understand what Mumbai is. Mumbai is if we have the whole population of Portugal in the south of Lisbon, the part south of Lisbon. And people live in these card boxes as if they were human trash. And in this place, in Mumbai, there was a man, one of the richest men in the world, the richest man in Asia, of those that live in Asia, and he decided to build his private home, 27 stories, 6 of which are just for his car collection, 9 lifts, party saloon, and 6 people live there, and 600 employees to make it work. And then, in the project description, it says that there are natural plants on the facade to reduce the energy consumption. This is amazing.
Well, let me get back to what you just said and talk about technology. All of the previous speakers have mentioned technologies and somehow mentioned that we live in society 5.0, artificial realities and so on and so forth. Now, is this true? That is,
efetivamente esta
now, Pedro, this Society 5.0, can technology actually address all the problems and solve all the problems we're faced with? Or is this a fantasy or somehow an illusion so as to address a reality?
eu sou a favor das tecnologias. Portanto,
Well,
eu
I
sou
do love
gostar,
technology, I have
eu
to say.
sou muito
Well,
a favor
I love
das
fantasy, says the
tecnologias.
gentleman. No,
Pronto,
I
eu sou contra.
favor technology. As even as
Se
moderator, I'm
em relação
sort of challenging all of you.
Eu estou bastante próximo ali de uma parte da intervenção do Miguel.
Well, somehow I agree with something that Miguel just pointed out,
Mas eu já vou à tecnologia, mas
and
numa sociedade,
that is,
eu não quero ser assim dramático.
we now live in a society, and I don't want to be very dramatic, but Jungmann actually wrote in the Society of Tiredness, meaning we feel busy with the things that are not cross-cutting, that are not deep enough. And Cholan further says that, further talks about homo laborans, in the sense that we work so as to consume. And until we change this, nothing will happen. Because we won't be able to move away from this kind of snowball or vicious circle that we live in. Why is this so? Of course, the thing is that technology has brought about considerable benefits, and well, I certainly enjoy such technology. It has enabled us to build fantastic things and etc. Or something just fell. But this technological advancement enables us to devise some solutions for some problems, but does not enable us to address the main problem we're faced with, and that has to do with, and that is a civilizational problem. And as Miguel pointed out, it's sort of very weird that we have this very pretentious and snobbish view about our house, I mean the biosphere. I think that this is contradictory. I mean, this goes against our civilizational view. That is our state of knowledge as human beings, and this goes this all boils down to a very simple word, which is justice. Meaning, we spend all our lives talking about justice, but we actually live in a very, very unjust, very unfair society. And unfortunately, let me tell you that technology is only free or open, so to say, to some. And unfortunately, that technology has not effectively contributed to a democratic access to well-being, and hence it has actually led to injustice. I'm not saying that technology is not good. I think technology has to be put at the service, at the service, so as to improve the quality of living. We cannot consider. We cannot consider, or we should not, or it's very hard for me to understand when you talk about externalities, when you talk about some economic models, meaning if or anything that may be harmful for a company, then it's considered an externality. And then someone will have to deal with such externalities. And of course, this is totally unfair, and will keep being a burden to society. and certainly goes against what the so-called to the so-called developed society. I believe that technology is important, but it only addresses a few of the problems. Well, let me go back to Susanna. Do you think that we are actually creating this 5.0 society, or does this respond to the fantasy? Well, I tend to agree more with the previous speaker. Of course, technology is crucial, and it's very good if we can use it for the good, so to say. Also, of course, there are considerable developments and advancements in the technology, and that can be very, very positive and very, very good. Actually, in my PhD dissertation, I actually researched and concluded that energy efficiency is necessary, but it's not enough. Why? Because if we analyze 40 years of energy policy in the EU, we see that, and I don't know whether things have changed that dramatically, but basically we are always ferociously hunting or wanting more and more and more. We want more efficient technology, and we end up consuming more. And of course, this will have an impact in the environment. Of course, there were countries that managed to somehow reduce, the negative impacts, but generally speaking, the investment made in energy efficiency has not been effectively offset by, positive results. Now, in the past, how would we have a light in our house? A bulb in the middle of a room. Now, and I hope that our friend architects won't be offended by this, but people talk about efficient lighting of the house, and they use lights in a very different way. Why is that? Because they have less sun, less natural light, and therefore they use different techniques. And of course, different societies and different geographical locations will certainly adopt different methodologies. This has to do with the culture, of course, and their specific conditions. But at large, we tend to import models which somehow are more energy intensive. Usually, we no longer have, one bulb in the middle of a big room. We also have a lamp on a desk and this and that and the other. I remember, I vividly recall that not every family had a TV. Today, every family has one. Fridges now can be more effective, but they are usually larger than they used to be. And there are analyses of the impact of women joining the labor market and how this somehow led to an increase in actually purchasing new equipment, namely a fridge. Because, women no longer have the time to go shopping, for groceries every day. So you need to actually accumulate more, food to actually cook when you need. If we compare that to what used to happen like 20 or 30 years ago, it's totally different from what it is today, in the sense that we tend to use part of our efficiency, increasing the technology itself. There are different aspects in the architectural field that are very interesting. But say, for example, the actual area of houses and apartments today entails having more things to actually fill them in, and I'm not even mentioning heating or cooling. This is terrible from the environmental standpoint. Is the fact that more and more people or apartments do not have balconies, which was where people used to sit or actually have clothes hanging out to dry. Today very or fewer people actually dry clothes naturally, and instead they tend to use the dryer, which requires so much energy. So when we ask whether technology is necessary or not, I mean, well, we need to actually put in place some change. But we have to consider that if, for example, a family does not have a place to hang out clothes to dry, it's important that at least the machine is very energy efficient. But if people have to use it, let's hope that, for example, in a building, instead of having every apartment or every family with the washing machine and the dryer, to have a common space where for all the inhabitants of the apartments. You see, the movement I belong to defends that technology is so important. It can play a very important role in actually improving the situation. And let me tell you that I'm not actually denying technology. I believe that the technology has a pivotal role. The problem, though, is that people tend to expect too much from technology and go to another extreme. It's just like architecture. It's not that architecture comes from out of the blue. No, I mean there were different models. There are these ideas and the societal development and so on and so forth. I know that the reduction of emissions of carbon, for example, carbon dioxide. I mean, people actually discussed, or experts actually discussed how to actually build houses so as to cope with the climate challenges and climate changes. So some people defend that homes have to be small and modular. But who is discussing how housing is actually going to be? And is this actually linked to the reality we live in? Say, for example, we have a washing machine. You buy one and then it will last 30 years, but usually a house may last for centuries. And right now we are going through a critical phase because, the current ecological package at the European level and the rehabilitation component is being actually considered very, very important. We know that some houses do not have the right conditions for people to live there, and they are problems in terms of energy, carpet, and so on and so forth. But I believe that at the same time, this represents a tremendous opportunity for architects, engineers, scientists, and so on and so forth to actually get together and see how this rehabilitation can be put in place in an effective manner. How can actually rehabilitation take place without leaving anyone behind? Because as we very well know, we sometimes, when you want to rehabilitate an area, you say, you no longer need a solar panel, or maybe you don't need to insulate walls or very special windows, etc., etc. But if we do not consider these technologies, say, for example, solar panels, the person or the family living that will come and live in this house will not have the means to actually subsequently install such equipment. So I believe that, or at least my perception as a layperson in the field, I think that there are specific types of knowledge that can actually be innovative to ensure quality of living for people and at the same time reduce the waste of energy and resources in our houses. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanna. Now, my third counter architecture or counter technology. Well, technology. Well, I'm not against counter. Let me start with a statement I was discussing with Alexandra a while ago by Fuller. Humanity has all the technology for the wrong aims, and that's what happens. We are polarizing our expectations, our wishes about technology as if it was salvation. Now, to be against technology is somewhat absurd, in my opinion. I hope historians will not stone me, but I believe after physiology, technology appeared. As men appeared on Earth, even before language, technology appeared to invent ingenious ways of overcoming difficulties around him. So the notion of architecture is a technological vision of living and inhabiting. Languages can also be called a codified technology. Yes, technology is an extraordinary thing. The problem is when we interpret technology as sophistication. And sophistication, because today we are all very seduced by sophistication. It's cool to be sophisticated. There's nothing wrong with that, but the root is sophism, and it means a lie, a lure. So technology as sophistication of our lives, or a Sebastianism of our salvation through technology, applied to architecture is a bit like buildings with a lot of technology, but then they say they consume zero energy, and we make the reading of energy consumption during the life of the building, not upstream and downstream. So energy, intrinsical energy, the energy of the matter. Sorry if that's the wrong word. Not downstream after the building is demolished, the waste it leaves, the impact, even the duration of the building. Besides, Susanna, congratulations, because I am a bit bored with zooms, but your zoom background is great. It looks like you're piloting your attic. Very nice setting, but forget about this aside. So what was Susanna saying? What I was thinking about? Oh, how duration of housing. But that's changing too, because there are houses buildings in general that can last hundreds of years, thousands of years, but the houses built today, they last a few dozen years, and they are built in a conscious way to last I don't say it intentionally, but consciously to last dozen years. Well, maybe it's intentional because André Gillette taught us a lot of things and we learned well. Now, as far as technology is concerned, of course I use technology. I have a mobile phone and all that things. I mean, everyone has. I use my computer to draw and all that, but Bruno Zevi said something interesting about the evolution of architectonic styles, and in a book, I cannot remember the name, one of his books, he mentioned the Renaissance, said that the Renaissance was an event, a very complex event in social terms, in the history of ideas, but as far as architecture is concerned, it's based basically on the invention of rules of perspective. And what was very interesting as a technology to represent the space, perspective, soon became a language. So it subverted itself. What was supposed to be a tool became language, and we keep doing this. Every time we invent something to serve certain purposes, we become slaves of that. And that's the fear I have about technology, that we may become hostages to technology, unable to look beyond it. I'm sure you all were in situations, at least with architects, this was I'm old. I started to work many years ago at the first years of my experience when computers appeared, when there was a power breakdown, we just look at each other, well, what is life? What did we do before? So we became slaves to technology. Didn't know what to do. So, answering your first question a while ago about my experiences, I've been lucky enough, I've been fortunate to work in contexts where we work just with our hands. I mean, to cut a long story short, in IT, I work with carpenters that build. In IT, I work with carpenters that build a house with a knife, a field knife, and so the history of technology. You have to add some hint of salt. Not in favor, but not also against. So it's about time to open the floor. Who wants to break the ice and ask the first question? Are there online questions? No. There is one question already. It was just an excuse to remove the mask. Well, these questions will have to be asked to the microphone, otherwise we cannot hear in the booth. I think that an interesting question here is, while models can understand the functioning of the planet, then that's very difficult to predict. We need sophisticated models, and our perception capacity is not able to encompass the whole world. And even that urban crisis, the question how cities should be structured, maybe that should also be based on that idea. We are totally apart, dissociated from the production processes. People don't know what they need to have what they enjoy. Technologies we use are so sophisticated that we are dissociated from what is more important, and what is more important is increasingly more distant from urban centers, as Romeo Marques said. So the scale of what we use is increasingly broader, and the scale of our knowledge about what we need is increasingly smaller. So what is the role of locale, of the place? How can the place become a response? And maybe even local technologies, local building technologies are the most obvious answer to each place. But there is something also very interesting, which is the migration of aesthetics, migration of ideas that work in a place, but that will not make sense on another place. Technology contaminates superficialities. I see things I do not know how they work, or maybe I do, but I make a very superficial assessment. So the question is about this localism, what is perception of the planet versus localism, what answers can we find here and there?
Esta provocação vai diretamente.
So it's a provocation direct to Pedro.
A pergunta ou a reflexão é muito
Well,
interessante.
it's an interesting reflection.
Queria começar pela
Let
questão
me
do
start
que
with
é o local,
what is
regional e global.
local, regional,
E há
and
pouco, na
global.
minha primeira intervenção, eu falei,
A
por exemplo,
while
que
ago,
em
I
Portugal,
mentioned an example that in
claramente,
Portugal,
as alterações climáticas
climate
entraram
change
na agenda mediática
came to the media
e também
agenda
na casa das
and to
pessoas,
people's houses,
devido a estes extremos que foram
people's homes,
localizados,
because of these
que são
extremes,
a questão de
localized
termos estes
extremes, these
extremos climáticos que afetaram
climate
localmente
extremes
pessoas.
that affected locally
E há aqui esta
the
ressonância
people.
clara
And there is
entre,
this clear
as
resonance
pessoas,
between
só se sentirem
that people
implicadas quando são
only
afetadas
felt
localmente e dissociar-se
involved
do
when
é
they are
global, porque
locally
não-
affected,
não-
and so
não-
they
não
and
conseguem
not
ou não
globally.
têm
They
tempo, ou não
don't have the
querem
time or do not
percepcionar
want
o que é
to
um
perceive
problema global.
what is a global problem.
De facto, os modelos, quando nós falamos dos modelos do sistema
When we
Terra,
talk
e é uma
about
das
the
nossas-
Earth
um dos
system
desenvolvimentos que
models,
hoje,
and
trabalhamos nas
one of the
universidades e
things we
também em
work
Lisboa, é que estes modelos não são
on
só modelos do
cities in
sistema
Lisbon,
Terra.
they are not models of
Pois eles
the
são
Earth
regionalizados,
system, they are
e nós
regionalized,
temos modelos
and
sobre
we have
a Península
models on
Ibérica,
Iberian
sobre Portugal,
Peninsula,
e
on
depois
Portugal,
também temos
and
modelos
also
sobre
models
Lisboa,
about
em
Lisbon,
que são modelos
where
também
these
em
models
que temos o edificado e temos
the
tudo,
building,
uma panóplia de componentes do
things,
sistema
the all
local,
local
e com essa descrição
system
do
components,
meio físico,
and with
podemos
this
perceber
description
melhor
of
como
the
é que
physical model, we can
digamos,
understand
o clima
better the local,
evolui no século
how the
XXI. Essa é uma
local
das nossas
climate
grandes preocupações,
evolves.
é que
That's one of our
as
main
alterações
concerns.
climáticas
Climate
são
change
ditas globais, mas
are
são
said
sentidas só
to be global, but they are
localmente.
felt
E a
locally.
comunidade científica,
And the
nos últimos
scientific
tempos,
community
nos últimos 10
in the
anos,
last 10 to
tem
20
tido como
years
principal preocupação,
has
de
been
facto,
very concerned
ir ao
about
local, ou
going
seja,
local,
caracterizing
characterizing
as
the
consequências das alterações
consequences of
climáticas,
climate
com
change
diferentes cenários,
in
à
different
escala de um
scenarios,
país, à
at
escala
the
de uma
scale of a
região,
country, at the
para
scale of a region,
permitir assistir
to
o que é a
allow
decisão, desde a
for
nacional ao
decision,
local. Isto é conceito muito
decisions
interessante
to be
no que
made
é a evolução
locally
das
and
ciências,
nationally.
digamos,
So this is a
físico-climáticas.
very short
Depois há
description.
outra coisa
Now,
muito
another thing
importante,
that is very important
que é
is
a questão
the question
da narrativa. Hoje
the
em dia,
narratives.
se fizerem uma pesquisa no Google,
If you do a
existem
Google
montes de
search,
artigos
there are a
científicos
lot
que falam,
of
isto parece uma contradição de
scientific
storytelling.
papers about
Hoje,
storytelling.
nós, depois de anos e anos a tentar
Years and years after we tried to communicate a global problem
que
that
só tinha manifestações locais em
only
alguns
had
sítios,
local
e por isso eram percepcionados em
manifestations
alguns
in
locais
certain
pouco,
places, in certain
a comunidade
sites,
científica começou
then
a
the
querer
scientific
comunicar as
community
alterações climáticas através
communicated
da
climate change
narrativa.
through
Ou
narrative,
seja, de
storytelling,
pegar, por exemplo,
understanding.
nas
So
inundações de
take the floods of 1967 in Lisbon, for instance.
parece que mataram 500
It seems
pessoas,
that
ninguém sabe
500
bem,
people died, but no one knows it for sure,
e
or
nós
many
pegamos
were
nesta
killed.
narrativa
And
do
so
que é
we
que seria
take
uma
this
inundação
narrative
destas
of
no final do
such
século
a
XX.
flood in the end of
E esta forma de
21st century.
comunicar tem-se,
And this way of communicating
implementado na comissão
has
científica,
been
na
increased
comunidade
in the community,
científica,
in the scientific community,
mostrar narrativas
to
que
show
são
narratives that
eminentemente
are
locais,
very
implicam
local
diretamente as
and that
pessoas
engage
e o seu
people
futuro e
directly
dos
and their
seus
future
entes queridos.
and the future
Então,
of their
tem
loved
sido uma
ones.
evolução e faz muito
This
em
has
conta
been the evolution,
ao que disse.
and it
Ao que disse.
goes a
Depois
bit
há
against
a
what you
questão
said.
da
And then there
tecnologia,
is the
ficamos noutra.
issue of
De
technology.
facto, uma das
One
respostas que a
of the
tecnologia
answers
nos
that
pode dar,
technology
que não
can
é só
give us, it's
tecnológica,
not just
ou,
technological,
por outro lado, podemos vê-la como
well, we can see it as
digamos, uma percepção ampla do que
a
é
broader perception of
o termo tecnológico, é que
technology,
a mobilidade
is
tem
that
que ser diferente.
mobility
Nós temos
has
que
to
ter
be different.
tanto meios de produção,
We must have
como meios de
production
abastecimento, estas
means
cadeias de produção que falava o Viriato no início,
and the
as questões
supplying
da nossa
means
mobilidade
of our
têm que
mobility
depender
has
da
to
produção
change
local.
on
E só dessa forma
has to depend on local
é que
production.
nós podemos
That's the
contribuir
only way
para a
we can
solução do tal
contribute
problema,
to solve the
implicando
problem.
uma nova maneira de
With
estar
a
no
new
meio
way
local
of
e
being in the
regional
local
e
and
não
regional
num meio, digamos,
environment
global,
and not
que
on a
implica uma
global environment that
mobilidade global.
implies global mobility.
Acho que esta provocação também
I
pode,
think
de alguma
that this
maneira,
provocation
ser
can also be
tratada aqui
dealt
pelo
with
Miguel.
by Miguel.
Batida com alguma,
Of course.
com alguma inépcia, mas enfim.
Maybe I'm not very able to, but I will try.
O que tu tinhas dito?
What did you say?
Sim, eu estava a tentar lembrar-me de um ponto
I
que
was
tinhas
trying
focado,
to
que me parecia interessante,
remember something you
que é a
said that
história
was
das
interesting.
tecnologias locais e das migrações.
Local technologies
que é muito
and
pertinente
migrations. It's very
porque,
important to mention that.
porque de facto, uma das
One of
há duas razões
there are
principais.
two main
Eu explico porque é que
reasons.
falo. Eu trabalho, como a Alexandra apresentou
I
no
work,
princípio,
as
mais ou
I
menos em
said at the
vários
beginning, in
países
several
e em
countries,
contextos, quer de
and in
desenvolvimento,
different
quer de
contexts of
pós-catástrofe.
development,
E, portanto,
post-catastrophe.
trabalho muito com
And so I
situações de
work a
carência
lot
por vezes
with
extrema, e
situations
trabalho
of
muito com
extreme
situações
poverty
de carência
and
por vezes extrema.
situations
Só que por motivos diferentes, que é ou carência perene, ou
long-lasting
trás,
poverty
ou
that
carência
comes
motivada
from
por uma
behind or
É muito mais
poverty
simples compreender
caused
as carências
by a
motivadas por trás,
catastrophe.
por catástrofes.
They are much
Emocionalmente, quer dizer,
easier
porque
to
há uma razão
understand
concreta para tu identificares
in
o mal
emotional
daquelas pessoas.
terms.
Mas em ambas,
But in both of them,
assiste-se a esse fenómeno da perda de saber,
but in both,
saberes que são a maior parte das vezes empíricos,
there is this
da
loss
perda de
of
saberes que podem
knowledge
fazer face aos riscos, sejam eles concretos, sejam eles
that would allow us to
latentes.
face risks.
E há uma espécie de migração de dois tipos. Há uma migração realmente física,
And there
das
are
pessoas
two
que vêm,
types
há uma
of
espécie de
migration: physical
migração
migration,
racional, emocional, cronológica.
rational, chronological migration. In all places where I worked, it's not that there was a lot of them, but everywhere I worked on with earthquakes or post-earthquakes,
Descuidar bastante acentuado das boas práticas de
good
construção,
building
como se costuma
practices
dizer,
are a little bit forgotten
relativamente a sismos, com o passar dos anos.
as
A
time
onda é mais ou menos assim.
goes
Quando há
by. It's
sismo,
like this. There is an earthquake, yes, good practices, but then time goes by, people forget about it, and then another earthquake, and so people just forget about it, they neglect.
Portanto,
So-
há que haver, para já, uma valorização, isto agora dando uma espécie de resposta, uma valorização da
So
sabedoria,
there is
dos saberes tradicionais, fundados numa terra,
traditional
fundados num
knowledge
contexto,
are valued on a given place, on a given local, because they are extremely valuable. There are so many basic
nas
things.
Filipinas, quando
Like
vem
in
tufão, eles sabem que
the
há tufão,
Philippines,
eles
when a
têm
typhoon is
sistema de
coming, they
proteção
know the
equivalente às
typhoon
casas,
is
levam-nas às
coming,
portas com
and they have
seguro,
houses
levam
that
lá
they are able to
vídeo, vão
move
lá
their
para
houses
e
around
passa
and
o tufão,
protect, and
eles
then the typhoon
funciona
passes and they go back, and it works.
dezenas e dezenas de anos,
They've been doing this for thousands or for hundreds of years, and it works better than any construction in concrete, because it works
físico,
in
não é?
physical
Da resistência da
terms, the
estrutura,
resistance of the
como
structure,
funciona do ponto de vista
and
dinâmico da
in
sociedade e da
dynamic
cultura da
system of
sociedade, que
society,
sabe
the culture of society,
promover, sabe
that
fazer,
knows
sabe
how to
manter, sabe
promote this, how
refazer,
to
sabe reparar,
rebuild, how
e
to
tudo isso
repair,
contribui para uma dinâmica
and
de
this
identidade cultural,
contributes to
para
the
uma
dynamic of the culture
socioeconómica
society as is the
da
socio-economic
própria
dynamic of the
sociedade de contexto.
society itself.
E nós temos uma tendência,
And we
voltando à questão da
tend
tecnologia,
to,
para
back
vir com
now
tecnologia
speaking about technology again, we have all this
sobrepormos totalmente a
specialized
isso.
technology as it
Que
was,
é,
as
o que é
it,
antigo
that's
é-
better than
lá
that.
está a história da
It's
sofisticação, não é? O
ancient,
que é
it doesn't
antigo é
work.
para deitar fora,
Sophistication is the
porque
best,
isto
it's
não
ancient,
presta
it
para
doesn't
nada.
work, it's
E o que é moderno é que
worthless.
é bom. Mas sabemos de
Modern
forma
is
por
good,
via
but
empírica...
we know empirically.
Desculpa?
Sorry,
Não, tem que ser sem máscara, porque assim não chega cá.
you have to move to take the mask off, otherwise I can't understand.
Para mais a simplicidade é sofisticada, portanto, uma resposta simples.
Simplicity can be sophisticated. A simple response can be sophisticated, right?
De meios, de uma economia de energia.
We are also saving
Sim,
on
eu não
energy.
chamaria isso sofisticação, mas
I
percebo o que quer dizer e
wouldn't
estou de
call
acordo.
it sophistication, but
Totalmente
I
de acordo.
understand what you
Simplicidade é
mean,
uma coisa
and
mais
I
difícil
agree.
de alcançar, não é?
Simplicity is hard
E
to
é mais
achieve,
genial, as coisas geniais são sempre
and
simples,
it's
sempre.
genuine.
E depois queria falar sobre
But
outra
let
coisa,
me
em
speak
relação
about
a isso
something
também,
else.
sobre a história das migrações.
Yeah, about the history of migrations.
Nós
We
vivemos,
live.
eu não quero parecer manicaísta,
I
mas,
don't want to sound
mas,
manichaeist, but
eu dá-me uma ideia que há uma espécie de era pré-TV
Seems
e
to be that
pós-TV.
there is a
No sentido
pre-television
que
and
desde que há 2 homens na Terra,
post-television
não sei
age.
quando começaram, mas
Since there,
dois a uma certa
there
altura,
are
pelo
two
menos.
men on Earth, or men
Eles
and a woman,
contaminam-se.
they
Não estou a falar de Covid, estou a falar de
contaminate each
contaminação
other.
de
I'm
ideias
not talking
e
about
hábitos,
COVID,
etc.
I'm talking about
Covid
ideas,
também.
habits, well, virus as well.
E a
And
contaminação
contamination
de
of
ideias,
ideas,
de
of
hábitos,
habits,
de
of
vontades,
uses,
de anseios, etc. É uma
wishes.
coisa perfeitamente normal e até saudável.
Very
de alguma
normal,
forma.
it's healthy,
É estimulante.
it's
Agora,
stimulating.
isso acontecia
But that happened
até
until
a TV é uma generalização, não é?
television appeared. Television here is a generalization,
Acontecia
but it
no
happened
local, ou seja, eu,
at a
quando
local
eu via a casa do meu vizinho
level.
da aldeia do lado,
I looked at my
ou do
neighbor's
país onde eu fui,
house or
lá, eu estive lá,
a
eu
country I
sentia.
went to,
Eu senti
and
se
I
fazia calor ou
was
frio lá
there.
dentro ou não.
I
Hoje em
felt
dia
it, whether
estou
it was
sentado
warm
numa
or
marleja.
cold. Now I'm sitting
ver
in
uma casa na
Alentejo
Finlândia
and
e,
looking at a
mas
house
porquê?
in Finland
Fazer
and
umas
thinking,
janelas
I'd
também,
love to
uma
have a
casa
house
assim,
like
uma
that.
marleja.
I'm going to build something
Que
like that
capaz de não
here in
funcionar bem,
Alentejo.
não é?
Maybe it
Porque
won't
não
work
temos essa
because we don't
experiência
have that
sensorial
sensorial
com a
experience
realidade pela qual ansiamos.
with the reality we want to achieve.
Aquela imigração
So
de
this
ideias,
tele-migration of ideas, remote conveyance of ideas, and this is migration of ideas, migrations at all levels. In terms of migration of peoples, the most basic question is in developing countries,
muitas vezes por questões
sometimes due to economic reasons,
também por questões de guerra
so
ou
because of
coisas do género.
wars and all
Há
that,
migrações em massa.
mass
para os centros
migrations to urban
que
centers.
acontece em
What
cidades
happens
como, por
in
exemplo,
cities like,
Para dar um exemplo muito
just to
flagrante,
give you a very
Antananarivo,
clear example,
em Madagascar.
in
É uma cidade que é
Madagascar,
formada por
Antananarivo,
platós,
it's
por
built on
planaltos. E sobram, estão todos ocupados.
plateaus,
Sobram os pântanos.
and then what
Que é
is
onde
left
vai revelar também
is the
uma coisa
swamps. That's
que
where
não tem
you
explicação,
have
como aquelas
the shanty towns,
E a solução para aquilo também é muito complicada,
and
não é?
the
Porque
solution is very
é de facto uma
complicated
coisa que
because
não devia estar lá.
it
não devia
shouldn't
existir
be
ali,
there
gente.
to begin with.
Mas depois há situações
But then
menos
there are situations that
problemáticas,
are not
como é o
so
caso,
problematic,
simplesmente de,
like
sei lá, cidades, olha, de Moçambique.
in
Em que as pessoas
Mozambique,
migram
for
para-
instance,
migram para a
people
capital,
migrate
migram para os
to
grandes
the
núcleos
capital or
urbanos,
to
não são
main
cidades em
urban
Moçambique, não há
centers.
tantos núcleos
Not
urbanos
that
quanto
there
os
are
grandes.
a lot of them in Mozambique.
O que acontece é que
And
por
what
saber-
happens is that
saber
the
viver,
knowledge,
eu não estou a
the
falar aqui de
know
forma
how to
filosófica,
live.
saber
I'm not speaking
construir
in
casa
philosophical
e
terms. I know how
tomar
to build
conta das
a
coisas
house,
e
how to
adaptar-se ao clima,
adapt
aos
to the
ritmos,
climate.
etc. É muito empírico, está muito
That's very
ligado
empirical.
ao
That's
seu contexto. As pessoas, quando são
relates to
descontextualizadas, os seus
the context.
saberes
If people
deixam
are out of
de-
context, their knowledge,
deixam de
their
ser válidos, de
know-how
alguma
is no
forma.
longer valid.
Portanto,
And
a valorização,
valuing,
agora uma pescadinha de rabo na
now
boca,
to
não é?
go back to the beginning, valuing
desses saberes que são
these
fantásticos,
knowledges,
é a
this
única maneira,
know-how is, which is fantastic,
de,
is the
passando
only
por
way
uma parte pedagógica, de educação, valorização, sensibilização, é a única maneira de os integrar
to
numa
integrate
perspectiva
them in a
científica, não é? Ou seja, uma
scientific
espécie de-
way that is
de visão sincrética no que esta expressão tem de bom, não é? No que é de mau.
syncretic vision
Das respostas
the
face aos riscos.
answers to the risks.
E não, pura e simplesmente, acharmos
not
que
just
isso não faz
to
parte
think
do que era
that it's
antigamente,
not-
isso não faz parte porque já não estamos
Doesn't
para isso,
matter
isso já não
because
faz parte.
that's
Alguém me explique
old-fashioned.
porque é que hoje em dia nós só usamos
Can
tinta
you
e não usamos cal. Alguém me
Explain
explique,
why
para dar um
today
exemplo
we
assim muito-
only
Eu não
use
entendo.
paint
Podem dizer 20 razões, mas eu continuo sem entender.
and not
Com todas as
whitewash,
vantagens a todos os
because
níveis que a cal tem sobre a
whitewash
tinta.
has a
Percebes?
lot of advantages.
Não é moderno, não é sofisticado.
But it's not
Não,
modern,
nem
it
o
is
preço,
not
nem o
sophisticated,
preço.
not even the prices.
Pois, está bem. Portanto, não entendo muito bem.
I don't
E para
understand.
concluir com uma frase de
And
um senhor,
to
já são os meus
conclude,
10 segundos de revolucionário.
just
pode
my
ser?
revolutionary
Uma frase
10
de um
seconds, do you
senhor
allow?
que me é muito caro, que é o Proudhon.
Proudhon, I like him
A
very much.
revolução vem depois da
Revolution
revelação.
comes after revelation.
Acho que estamos. Eu tenho recebido notícias do tempo.
Well, I was,
Chegar ao final.
or my attention was drawn to the fact that we have to be careful with how we manage time. I don't know if there are any further questions out there. If not, there is a topic that we can't but mention, which is COVID. Of course, this will certainly lead to a new urban cartography and neighborhood living that may be back, you know. So we will have, I mean, the public space will be sort of smaller, but where we feel more comfortable. That is the case in Austria, France, or Paris, elsewhere. The mayors are actually urging people to actually create this public space. That is, let's go back to the street. Of course, this entails new aesthetics, new rules, new mobility. I would like for you to tell us a bit about this. What does this mean, in your views? I mean, socially, architecturally, technologically, what do you think is coming down the road?
E começo. Devia ser por si, mas não. Vamos começar pela Susana.
We're starting with Susanna.
Mobilidade.
So, mobility,
Cidade, espaço público.
society, public space.
Obviamente, esta crise, como já foi referido aqui, aliás, não é?
Of course.
Pode vir a ter aspectos, reflexos positivos.
This crisis may be negative and positive. Of course, in terms of mobility, of course, the idea is that, of course, we're going against our old traditions, all the habits, you know. The fact that you have, you know, the travel card and so on and so forth. So, and I'm very familiar with the situation because I live quite far away from the center, from the city center. So now, because the travel pass has now encompassed the different transportation modes and prices decreased, so this is more motivating for people, but the people need to travel less. So, but we need to consider this from a mobility logic, so to say. There are other positive aspects, including the fact that people use more bicycle, and many people actually consider this as an alternative to, you know, to avoid using public transportation, which has to do with the number of people. I mean, with public transportation being quite crowded. But of course, this goes against the old principle of promoting public transportation, simply because this way we would have less cars out in the street. So we really don't know exactly what's going to happen, although, of course, now we have teleworking, you know, working from home. Many people will be able to actually keep it, at least partially. So this may be positive, I'd say. But you know, many companies will probably go back to the old methods. We will need to conclude, the moderator says. So I believe that there are contradictory signs. Some positive aspects, but not everything is going to be positive. The fact that people actually start using more, you know, smaller neighborhood grocery stores and stores at large may actually be very positive. But let's. Everything is going to be all right. 1 minute for you. Well, I don't want to repeat what Susanna said, but I believe that city planning will be pivotal in terms of addressing this crisis. So if we do not have to take people who work in town, to take them out of town every single day, I mean, if we can manage to keep people in, it will be different. Let's consider the quality of the air, the noise, and so on and so forth. And of course, I'm not being the good advocate for the pandemic, but If we consider different aspects, including noise and the possibility of actually experiencing the city in a different manner, we realize that urban planning, city planning is crucial. We'll have more people with more culture, with people developing their own specific strategies at their local or neighborhood level. And this way we'll be reducing the need for transportation between the city center and suburban areas. So ideally, if people live like 15 minutes away from everything, then that's fantastic, because I mean they can walk or they can take a bike or something. Well, 1 minute. I agree with everything. But I'm very sorry that the ground reason, the root reason for this is fear. Everybody is totally fearful and panicking. And I'm really sorry that this is the very reason for the whole thing. And I'm not being euphemistic. Unfortunately, this is not the via, the path we should follow. Well, we knew that sooner or later we would have this type of city, and I'm sure that what happened now in Lisbon, we had exactly the same in Marrakesh 30 years ago. But as the author quoted,
há muito tempo pelo arquiteto Ribertelos,
one, and that is what architect Ribertelos said, was the defending agriculture and farming, proximity farming, so to say, inside cities. But then we have the plazas and all that filled with cars. And the other thing is the fact that we are at the same time destroying cities and neighborhoods, because, I mean, if you close down bank branches or post office branches or health centers at the local level, I mean, if you're closing them down, of course you will be limiting the possibilities of the people living there. Well, we do have to conclude. Thank you very much again. I believe that this was a rather positive debate. I believe that we managed to get a few or some food for thought. So thank you to our guests, and let's wait for next session on Wednesday. Thank you. Bye-bye.
muito bem. É muito interessante ver os convites.